Informal. I'm the president of the New America Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to this event, which is entitled America's Changing Social Contract, the Rights and Responsibilities of Employers, Families, Government, and Civil Society. It's an event organized by New America's Next Social Contract Initiative, which I'll explain just a bit about as we get started here this morning. First, just a few housekeeping notes. There's obviously a buffet in the back today, and I hope throughout this day, which runs through the lunch hour, that we'll offer both literal and metaphorical nourishment to all of you. But please feel free to just get up and satisfy your hunger or your need for caffeine at any moment. This would probably be a good time just to double check to make sure your electronic devices are on buzzing or silent mode. And also just a reminder, as we turn toward questions, beginning with this first session, we're on the record here today. This is a public event. We are videotaping for use on New America's website, so keep that in mind as you fashion your remarks, but also keep it in mind as you wait for microphones to find you if you wish to ask a question, and we'd be grateful if you do participate in that way, if you would identify yourselves. Literally in a minute or two, I just wanted to orient us to today's panels by explaining a little bit about what brings us together from New America's point of view. New America, of course, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is a nonpartisan public policy institute. It's about 10 years old. We're engaged in work on domestic policy, foreign policy, and also independent-minded, free-thinking research and writing across a whole range of subjects. But the Next Social Contract, which is the source of our convening today, is a very important attempt on our domestic policy side to synthesize a lot of work that's been going on at the Foundation for the last 5 or 10 years. And it seeks to do this by reframing American social policy for the 21st century through a program of research and education. And what we're really trying to do is to explore the origins of our modern social contract and to articulate some principles for constructing what amounts to a new contract, and in addition to advance promising policy reforms that would speak to such a contract. And today's event really goes to the heart of this ambition by trying to explore the evolution of the American social contract over time and to start to talk about rights and responsibilities among the principal parties to that contract. Given the shape of our economy and the challenges of sharing our prosperity and the need to provide for broad-based economic security, we want to explore what are the most effective roles for government, employers, families, and civil society institutions. And this is obviously a basic set of questions, but in order to answer it, we think that it's important to try to articulate a set of principles that should lie at the core of this social contract, prospective social contract. And one principle that we're going to hear, I think, a fair amount about today is that the social contract should be citizen-based. And this notion may have many ramifications, but one central idea is to ensure that public benefits are linked directly to individuals and are not contingent upon employment. In an age when workers are increasingly mobile and change jobs frequently, either voluntarily or involuntarily, we think that benefits also need to be portable and accessible throughout one's life. Making benefits citizen-based is also necessary, we would argue, for American corporations and for American companies as they confront tougher international competition and confront the need to be freed from the costs of administering these benefits that have been part of the social contract arrangements through most of the post-war period. As global competition and the pace of technological change increases, the case for a citizens-based social contract, we would argue, one that enhances both the security of workers and the flexibility of employers, is growing stronger. And the development of a contingent workforce and the pressure of globalization on the corporate sector seem to us to underscore the logic for moving to a system of universal and citizen-based benefit provision. The social contract framework is a useful one for thinking about how to conceptualize and then implement social policy, because this idea of a grand bargain between citizens is resonant in the history of our country's politics. But what do we mean when we invoke the social contract as a framework for the kinds of discussions we're going to have today? Some of the questions that I think we'll explore over the course of these panels include: how has this largely unwritten deal evolved over time to provide individuals the security they need to navigate an increasingly volatile and dynamic economy? And in what ways do the economic changes we see all around us argue for changes in the social contract? Employers and workers and families are parties to this contract, but what is the proper division, the just provision, the efficient division of rights and responsibilities among them? And these are not only rhetorical questions, they are practical ones, and they have now, I think, entered much of our political discourse. You hear echoes of these arguments, even if they're a little bit underdeveloped in sectors of the current presidential campaign, which is encouraging. The discourse in this country about these subjects, even the larger and more abstract aspects of them, is changing. And we hope that this event will contribute to that change. I'd just like to introduce a few of my colleagues at New America who play an important role today as the day's events unfold. I'd like to recognize two of our senior staff who have overseen the Next Social Contract Initiative at New America during the last year: Michael Calabrese and Reed Kramer, who are both sitting up front. Reed's going to help keep an eye on the watch and keep us moving on time today, as well as having organized with Michael much of the content of today's program. They've done a terrific job both over the last year and in getting us organized today. I'd also like to mention Ray Boshara, who I think is in the back there, who has played an important role in getting us off the ground in this area and is going to continue to play an important role in organizing our thinking about domestic policy. And finally, Len Nichols. I'm not sure if Len is here this morning, but he is runs our healthcare policy program and has played a really instrumental role in constructing one of New America's cornerstone policy ideas for a citizen-based social contract, which is a healthcare plan that is sustainable and affordable and accessible and based on the idea of an individual mandate, which, as you know, has influenced the debate over healthcare reform in California, Massachusetts, and now is quite much at the center of the presidential campaign. We're very fortunate to begin today with the two gentlemen who are on the dais with me right now, Andy Stern and Carl Camden. They have offered already so much to the national debate about America's future from the perspectives of labor and business, both creative and progressive thinkers, and both very thoughtful. We're fortunate to start with their ideas. Our format, of course, as you might anticipate, is that each of them will talk for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll see if there's a little natural colloquy that flows out of their remarks up here, and then we'll turn to you to take us through the hour and contribute some questions of your own. Andy Stern, let me just introduce them very briefly before they speak. Andy is the International President of the Service Employees International Union, America's fastest growing union, nearly 2 million members. The New Yorker magazine, which I do some work for, has said that he has successfully pushed every Democrat in the race into supporting universal health care. and I don't think that's an exaggeration. Modern Healthcare's annual readers poll rated him its 5th most powerful person in healthcare. Maybe that's not something on his bathroom wall, but it's notable nonetheless. And beside him, to his right, is Carl Camden, who's the president and chief executive of Kelly Services, a Fortune 500 company headquartered in Troy, Michigan, and a world leader in human resources solutions. In 2006, he was appointed to the American Staffing Association's board of directors, and as you'll find today, he's not only does his company live on the edge of change in the labor economy, but he's a very creative thinker about those changes. We're going to start with Andy and then Carl. So.
Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Steve, and the New American Foundation for this honor and opportunity. I was thinking it takes a pretty courageous foundation to offer a labor leader a microphone, an audience, and as broad a topic as the next social contract. And I appreciate all the kind words Steve said about me. I'm here today on behalf of a lot of other people. On behalf of the security officers in San Francisco and Los Angeles who keep us all safe, for the 20,000 child care workers until recently, small businesswomen who took care of people in their homes who had no voice or hope, the 22,000 community-based personal care assistants who make true the words, "There's no place like home." These are all new members of our union, people who've decided to change their lives, and equally importantly, to change the quality of the services they provide. And it's for them I speak here today. I love my union, but I love this country. I think America's a gift. I think its greatest gift is that for generation after generation, people come to its shores. All they expect is to work hard. All they hope for is their work will be rewarded. But what they dream about is that their children will live a better life than they do. That is the American dream. And despite a civil war, 2 world wars, recessions, depressions, natural disasters, 42 different presidents, the American dream has endured. But today, 79% of all Americans no longer think that their child will do better than they will. That's not the America we want or need. But to allow our children to live out their dreams will mean facing up to very significant changes and challenges facing us all. This is not our fathers' or our grandfathers' economy. Those longingly looking to go back to the New Deal in 1935 should realize that we're as far today from the New Deal as the New Deal was from the Civil War. And I'm sure Franklin Roosevelt admired Abraham Lincoln, but he didn't build an industrial economy around 1865. We are not going to build a global economy around 1935. Today, our country, joined by the rest of the world, is living through the most profound, the most significant, the most transformative economic revolution in the history of the world. There have only been 3 known economic revolutions. The first was the agricultural revolution. It took 3,000 years. The second was the Industrial Revolution. It took 300 years. This third revolution, which is exactly what we're experiencing today, as we transform from a manufacturing to a service, finance, and knowledge economy, and more importantly, from a national to an international economy, this revolution is going to only take 35 years. No single generation of people in the history of our planet have ever witnessed an entire economic revolution, have never witnessed this much change in a single lifetime. This revolution is televised, it's Googleized, it's digitized, it's on your screens, in your face, 24/7. It is relentless, it is unending, and most importantly, it's far from over. We can now clearly see the emerging trends, some inspiring, some disturbing. First, Thomas Friedman's analysis is mostly right. The world is becoming flat, one global integrated marketplace. And the impacts are growing not just in the blue-collar workforce, But by 2008, we will ship 1.5 million white-collar jobs in America overseas. The second trend, we created global trade, global finance, global capital, global companies. And we forgot to create global governments, global organizations, global regulators. So today we watch more and more companies, not countries, making the rules of the global economy. Of the 100 largest economic entities in the world, half are companies and half are countries. And we're seeing the pressure that's being placed by companies on countries like France's employment policies, asking them to sort of loosen up on rigid historic employment practices, companies putting pressure on countries. Walmart sales are greater than the GDP of Ireland or Singapore. At the same time, we see the growth of new sovereign wealth funds. Countries now acting like companies. The first real ever global bankers and financiers with ideologies and constituencies. The third trend we face is that we have our first real economic competitor in America, China. I continue to say the 2008 Olympics will be a Sputnik moment for this generation as we sort of peel back the misunderstandings of what is going on in China for lots of people in our country not paying attention. 90% of all the scientists and engineers in the world will come from the Asia-Pacific region by 2010. Last year, 2 years ago, America was very proud. We had 65,000 Intel Science Fair finalists. China had 6 million. And for those of us who, the most we knew about China when we was growing up was that our parents talked to us about this is a poor rice-producing company. Last year, the world produced more transistors than grains of rice, and the transistors cost less. And many of them were made in China. The fourth trend, although it's potentially short-lived, is the ownership of companies is changing from public to private hands. Everybody knows that Walmart is the largest employer in America. No one understands that Bain Capital is the second largest employer in America, KKR is the third largest employer in America, and 6 of the 10 top employers in America are private equity funds. Basically, conglomerates who own companies in private hands, coupled with sovereign wealth funds, means that we need to conceptualize the social contract with a different kind of ownership and a different role for companies and countries. Sadly, as a result of those changes, I think we now all can see Americans economically are growing apart, not growing together. Goldman Sachs reports that wages and salaries are at the lowest share of the nation's gross domestic product in history, and profits are at the highest share. Last year, productivity was up, profits were up, and for the 5th straight year, the Census Bureau said American workers didn't get a raise. The longest period of economic stagnation in history. I'd like to say if we had only done one thing, the new social contract had merely been to index the wages of the minimum wage, to index the minimum wage in 1990 to CEO salaries, the minimum wage would be $23.03 today. That's how much we're growing apart. Alan Greenspan said it best. The gap between the rich and the rest of the population is growing so wide and so fast, it threatens democratic capitalism. Now, those are fighting words from a Federal Reserve chair. Second major result of this combination of globalization and technological change is that we're being freed, and I'm sure Carl's going to talk about this, from workplaces of the past. Employees and employers are separating, and they're on their way to getting a divorce. Our country is transitioning from employer-managed work lives, from a one-job-in-a-lifetime economy to self-managed work lives. My son, who is 21, is expected to have 9 to 12 jobs by the time he's 35. By 2010, 25% of all Americans, think about it, 1 in 4 Americans will either be self-employed or contingent. They will have no full-time employer. And only 1/3 of today's employers will be economically viable in 25 years because of all this massive change in our economy. So even if you want to stay with your employer's not going to be around to stay with you. Now, we don't need to be fearful about all of these changes. We just need to make sure we tackle the right problems. We still live in the richest country on earth. We still have 8 of the 10 greatest research institutions in the world. We're blessed, other than maybe in Detroit, with relatively low unemployment. We have high entrepreneurial talent. We have significant investment capital and natural resources. America's problem is not about growth. America has two problems. We have no plan. Team USA has no plan to compete in a global economy. And the second problem is we're just not sharing in the success of the economy. Restoring the middle class, making work pay, solutions that benefit the 99% of people who go to work every day, not just the 1%, is the critical problem we face. So a social contract filled with typical Washington, D.C., policy drivel or milquetoast, empirically flawed solutions that don't work for workers or make their children's dream come true is just a waste of very precious time. Change is inevitable, but progress, it's optional, which is why we need to build a new economic plan based exactly on what you're talking about around a new social contract. Now, before we talk about some of these solutions, I want to just offer what I think are the diversions that keep us from getting to the real questions about how do we reward work for the 99% of Americans, not just the 1%. First has been the long-standing belief that we should just let the market work. Just get out of the way and let the market work, which is obviously not credible when inequality is growing not just in the United States, but everywhere in the world. The market will not work as it did nationally in an international economy. Nor is trade the answer, if we haven't figured that out by now. I'm not saying we don't need to trade. Of course we do. That's part of a global economy. But trade is not the answer to rewarding work. President Clinton had a well-founded and a legitimate idea about how our children would prosper, and that was high-tech jobs. But we now appreciate that high-tech jobs are being sent overseas even faster than many other jobs. George Bush's denial that there really is a problem is not going to solve the problem as well. And finally, and provocatively, I want to say that education is the answer. Mantra is not the problem, is not the answer. Now, don't misunderstand me. I think every child has a right to the highest quality education and the greatest amount of skill training that they can deal with. That is their right. But here's the problem. BLS reports that we will need only 1% more college graduates by 2012. Only 8 of the 30 fastest growing jobs in America require a college education. And significantly, between 2000 and 2004, the real wages of college graduates fell 5.4%. So how can education simply be the answer? Low-wage jobs, as we call them, are just really low-paid jobs because there's nothing inherently low wage in being a Head Start teacher or a certified nurse assistant or fixing cable communications. There's nothing inherently low wage. They're just inherently low paid. Mine workers, auto workers, steel workers, truck drivers, construction workers in the last century taught us that you can have a middle-class lifestyle if there's a way to more fairly distribute the success of growing companies. It is not about growth, it really is about distribution. And unions were the function, the economic function that divided the wealth in the last century. My concern about education is it turns really structural problems we have in our economy into personal problems and makes everyone think that if they could only get an answer that somehow our economy would prosper in and of itself. It is part of the solution. It is certainly not the solution. Last thoughts on the social contract. First, the employer-based healthcare system is dead. It's dead. It's a relic of the industrial economy. We need a new American healthcare system, not necessarily Canadian or Scandinavian, but ultimately one that is not tied to your job. Every country has solved this problem. It is not a matter of policy. It's just a matter of politics, and this presidential election will have a lot to do with what happens to our healthcare system. 2, as employers and employees are getting divorced, we need to move more from employer-based to individually based pension systems. Today, only 18% of Americans even have a defined benefit guaranteed pension system. 50% of all private sector workers have nothing. No SEP, no 527, no IRA or 401k. All they have is Social Security. George Bush actually had something right in his presidency, which was about creating a personal account. The problem that you could take from job to job. The problem was how he funded the personal account by undermining the Social Security system. But in the end, we need people to have personal accounts that grow from job to job, that require contributions by employers and employees, that cannot be taken out along the way, and then in the end, we can convert that accumulated wealth into a defined benefit or into an annuity. Maybe we could even call it TIACREF or Australia, because that's exactly what they do. But on a national basis, the pool that we could create to create the annuities would allow people to both have the advantage of gaining wealth and having the advantages of a defined benefit. And finally, why doesn't our tax system reward work and not simply wealth? Why don't we start by just eliminating the first $100,000 of Social Security income a year and help pay for it by having stock options, carried interest, capital gains, and dividends, and lifting the cap? You know, why can't we have the most regressive form of taxation on work be changed to reverse it to cover all forms of income, but also deal with wealth? And then why don't we finance as a nation, as long as we're at it, the basis of commerce in the 21st century? You know, in the 1950s, we were really smart. The basis of commerce was highways, and we built the interstate highway system, the most open opportunity for entrepreneurs and individual businesses to transport goods from coast to coast. In the 21st century, it's not the interstate highway system alone, it's the internet highway system. And yet America hasn't come to grips with the fact that we have not made the same kind of investments in the internet highway system to have the kind of infrastructure and to allow every student in America, while we're at it, to be able to get on it for free so every child has opportunities for the greatest learning environment ever before. And finally, why don't we recognize what's been the most reliable, the most successful, the longest-term anti-poverty program that's worked, and most importantly, that hasn't cost the government a dime, and that's been a union job with a union contract, bargained now by a partnership-oriented, pro-competitive, pro-quality union. Organizations that understand in the 21st century markets and competitions and solve problems for employers, not simply, as we did in the past, create them. Regardless of what you think about unions, there's only been 3 ways to distribute wealth in our country's history: the market, which has failed, government, which has failed, and unions, which are now just too weak to do their job, but are totally a bona fide economic way to distribute wealth in our society. So we're at a historic crossroads, and it's a moment that the futurists, I want to quote Heidi and Alvin Toffler, say, "Humanity faces a quantum leap forward. We are engaged in building a remarkable new civilization from the ground up. America needs to adopt my old adversary Newt Gingrich's admonition. We need to plan back from victory like you're trying to do here, not present forward to the future." And when the politicians in Washington, I hope, would remember what Helen Keller once said, because I think it somewhat applies to me: the most pathetic person in the world is someone who has sight but no vision. Margaret Mead once said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world." Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. On my desk is a plaque that says the best way to predict the future is to create it. And that's what we're here today to do. Thank you.
Good morning, y'all. Still the same tepid good morning response here. Thanks, Steve, for your introduction. Let me congratulate the New American Foundation for convening today's event and bringing together a wide variety of speakers and diverse perspectives that this subject deserves. This is now the second time that I've spoken on this topic in the last few months, and I can tell you that around the country, the debate on the format of the new social contract is beginning to take on a lot of steam, a lot of authority in advance of the presidential elections, more importantly in advance of, I think, new policy initiatives after that. Before tackling the new social contract, although I assume everybody here knows what the old social contract was, I do find it important to very quickly specify what was that old social contract that many of us are so quick to bury here. In basic terms, an employee's hard work and loyalty was matched by an employer's commitment to provide fair compensation, reasonable job security, and most likely, as Andy was saying, a pension. What we don't realize is that underpinning that old social contract was a requirement that job sites be relatively fixed. In other words, work couldn't move from place to place. that the type of work done at that job site remained relatively fixed, and that the employee could actually work long enough at that job site doing that job to earn a pension. And for most of the 20th century, buttressed by the fixed nature of work and by the fixed nature of competition, that model worked fairly well. But in the last 2 decades, we've seen rapid changes in the fundamental nature of work, and as a result, the employer-employee relationship has been fundamentally altered. The old social contract is basically obsolete, and it's time for a new social contract to emerge. Today's workers now change employers, careers, and work locations with great abandon. It's now not only socially acceptable. I'm old enough to remember the days when you changed a job, people wondered what was wrong, what happened. But now it's socially acceptable, and in fact, for my children, they talk about it being the fast track for career advancement, the change from job to job. Now, my own career has included stints as a tenured college professor, a small business owner, a marketing guy, and now a Fortune 500 CEO. So like many in this economy, I've changed careers, employers, and work locations frequently. But what I don't hear people talking about is what's happened in the last 2 decades to bring about this basic fundamental change in the nature of work and the resultant undoing of the social contract. Now, we often demonize globalization. In the media, globalization is generally identified as the primary driver behind this changing of the nature of work. And for sure, globalization is important in reshaping the way societies and individuals live and work. But we have to be honest with ourselves. Globalization isn't a new phenomenon. It's a new word that describes an old phenomenon. While the word globalization has obtained widespread popularity in the last decade, globalization began 60,000 years ago when the first migrants walked out of Africa and maintained trading ties with the old communities. Work and workers has always moved. When I gave an hour-long version of this speech at the University of Illinois, I went through long detail to show that globalization has always taken place. But for the moment, trust me, because you guys don't have an hour to go through that long a history here. But human history has always been marked, and major political movements have been marked by the continuous movement of work and workers around the world. So what's changed today? Well, certainly, as Andy was noting, the pace of economic and social change has quickened, and that increased pace of change coupled with today's 24-hour news cycle make that change far more visible than it has been in the past. But I have to tell you, the bottom line of all the scholarly research that I've looked at from my former colleagues concludes that the dislocation from globalization, while real and tremendously painful in the specific, in the aggregate is a very small contributor to the pace and quantity of the movement of work. While globalization is a contributor then to making work less fixed, technology is by far the most important driver. Technology has helped unwind the old social contract in 2 critical ways. First, location has become irrelevant for an ever-increasing number of jobs. And second, many specific jobs are becoming obsolete far more quickly than at any other time in history. So let's take a look at each of those 2 factors. First, consider freedom of location. There was a recent study done of Ruick County, Colorado. It's a county that includes Steamboat Springs. A recent survey of that county found that 10% of the year-round households there were involved in location-neutral business. They could work anywhere they wanted to. Those businesses included the lawyer who conducted his practice with clients around the country via email, a man who designs microchips, and so on. Now, location-neutral work is never going to become 100% of the work that's done. It's not practical for everyone, but I have to tell you, if I could do my job from Napa, I'd be there instantly. Now, second, technology has also contributed to the deterioration of the old social contract by reducing job life cycles. How long can a job be expected to persist? And that job life cycle has been shrinking ever more frequently. And as Andy was talking about, people expect them to have more and more jobs, not just because they want to change for the sake of career, but because jobs go in and out of existence. For many, the job that they have will not exist in its current form a few years from now. And everybody says, yeah, we know all about blacksmiths and buggy makers. No, I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the typical now 30 to 50% decline that takes place in jobs within 5 years after an introduction of a new technology. Consider bank tellers. Post the introduction of ATMs, we have only 20% of the bank tellers that we had pre-introduction of ATMs. What about the gas station attendant? Remember when that was the typical summer job we could always get to gain the work experience? Only 25% of those after the point-of-sale technology was introduced into gas stations. I'm old enough to remember those ads on TV that said, go to school and become a computer operator. That was the job guaranteed for life. BLS stats, one of the top 5 declining jobs in this country. Jobs obsolete now not in centuries, not in decades, but in years. Obsolescence is destroying the old social contract because the nature of work is not fixed. So while globalization has had a small, visible impact on the social contract, technology has permanently eroded the semi-fixed nature of work that enabled the old social contract to exist. And finally, the topic near and dear to my heart as head of Kelly Services, there also is the rise of the free agent workforce around the world, and their new perspective on work challenges the fundamental desirability of the old social contract. They don't want it even if you all could figure out how to resurrect it. Free agents now comprise 20 to 30% of the workforce in the US, Japan, and Europe. They have a variety of titles: temporary employees, independent contractors, freelancers, independent professionals, consultants, heck, for all I know, freelance journalists. They're educated, they're autonomous, skill-driven people, and they're very, very mobile. In general, free agents place a higher value on achieving a better balance between their life and work. Unlike the generation that I grew up with, they believe that you fit your work around your lifestyle rather than fitting your lifestyle around your work. And for this group of workers, the old social contract is dead, not desirable, and they don't mourn its passing. On their websites and blogs, they refer to traditional employees as wage slaves. They view belief in permanent employment as kind of naive. Consider just a few posts from J. Timothy Keen's blog on the top 10 reasons to remain a wage slave. And I won't give you all 10 of them, but just 3 of them will give you a sense of their political philosophy. It's all right, be a wage slave. It's just easier to coast on through life than to try to make a difference. You don't have to do any of the hard work, and you don't have to make any of the hard decisions if you're an employee, and you're not really a big dreamer. There's a lot more, including having to beg like a dog to get your Scooby snack when you want to raise. But you get the idea. So here's my bottom line on globalization and the demise of the old social contract. Globalization has always existed. It's here to stay. Not a thing we can do to make it go away. It has a modest impact on jobs and wages in the aggregate, but devastating consequences for specific communities and workers. Technological advances, on the other hand, have triggered a cavalcade of change, and as a result, fixed employment by employer and location is disappearing. And in the United States, it is time to stop trying to repair the old social contract. It is time to let the new social contract emerge, and in the process, let's accept the fact that we're just going to have to go about redefining dozens of American institutions, and it's okay. The old foundation was one person working for one company for one working life. The dimensions of the new social contract will be, let's accept the fact that we're in a constant state of flux. Individuals, employers, and governments, instead of looking to fix the nature of work, have to look to maximize opportunity and employability. Maximizing opportunity for employability is going to be one of the top social policies in a time of increasing dislocation of fixed employment. That 35-year period that Andy talked about isn't going to be easy. Dislocation is going to be best remediated by a frictionless matching of work and workers, but I have to tell you that current social policy in the U.S. doesn't help the matching of work and workers. Rather, it puts friction into the system in a way that makes it difficult for workers to stay employed. First, I'll echo what Andy said. Employer-based healthcare financing is just wrong. It is an anachronism. It's time for it to move on. Employees today stay in bad jobs with health care benefits because they can't find other jobs with equivalent benefits. Free agents are discriminated against in access to health insurance in terms of both prices and taxes, and it is from the free agent community that much of our entrepreneurial drive is going to be taking place. It is the failure of the current health care financing system that caused Kelly to join with Andy and the SEIU and others as founding members of the Better Health Care Together, a coalition urging comprehensive health care reform by 2012. Health care has become the transcendent issue influencing the domestic economy and global competitiveness. It is not just a political issue. If we wish to retain a competitive edge in the United States, we must fix the health care financing system. A second obstacle to workplace opportunity is basic government policy surrounding work. Government policy, from OSHA regulations to how we deal with pensions and benefits, have always been defined in terms of a fixed employer, in terms of a fixed location. That is an outdated concept of work. We need to clarify work rules and lots of government regulation with respect to non-traditional and the free agent workforce. Because I have to tell you, in the presence of ambiguity or fear of government oversight, risk-avoiding corporate officers will discourage free agency, will discourage entrepreneurism. For example, if an employer offers a telecommuting option to employees, how do workplace safety and independent contractor regulations apply? What if they don't sit at home, but instead take their work on a laptop to Starbucks? Every lawyer or regulator that I talk to will have a completely different view on it. All of them, of course, completely convinced they're right. We need clarity in work rules to accommodate the new economy. The next element of the new social contract is employability. Under the old social contract, employers provided training to help move workers from one job to another within the company. It was expected that companies would assume the role of keeping their workers employable. Now, while some of today's employees regret the passage of the old social contract, much of the new workforce is ready to reject that paternalism of the past and to accept the personal challenge of navigating their own career development. In the new social contract, individuals will take responsibility for their own skills and career development. Organizations will choose to invest in employee development and create an environment that stresses and facilitates continuous learnings. And government will support programs that promote a highly skilled workforce, assist populations that are difficult to employ, and provide training support to unemployed, underemployed, and dislocated workers. As the social contract shifts, you should know that businesses are in fact still continuing to invest in employee development programs, just not necessarily the stand-up training that helps people move from one job to another inside the company as they did before. I'm a strong advocate of enabling our free agent workers to be able to thrive in this country, but let me acknowledge that free agency does not work for everyone. There are limits. Even with recognition of the need to make the new social contract applicable to the modern workforce, there remains one important nagging caveat. Most of the focus of the new social contract is directed to the educated and skilled workforce, but the less skilled workforce is missing often from these discussions. Opportunity and employability doesn't take into sufficient account the needs of the less skilled or less paid. The new social contract simply doesn't work for this group, and it is creating a significant social policy challenge. With skyrocketing costs, fewer people in the U.S. are going to college and technical schools, and yet access to a middle-class life is increasingly requiring some post-secondary education. Construction, healthcare, home services, etc. will provide opportunities in abundance, but while these positions do not require college degrees, they are increasingly requiring post-secondary or technical training. There must be more training and education opportunities, and I agree with Andy, while it's not the answer, it is part of the answer that has to be made available, especially for the 40% of the workforce who will not pursue a college education. The pace of dislocation is picking up. If certainty was the driver of the new social contract, we now have to take it as a given that there will always be a high level of change and much greater ambiguity than many would like. But it doesn't mean that we're powerless to prepare for or shape the future. We can move now to adopt the policies that will help individuals gain the opportunity and employability that they need to participate successfully in the new social contract. I spoke earlier of the Better Health Care Together and our goal of comprehensive health care by 2012. But let me suggest a far more audacious challenge. Truly progressive social policy will establish the foundation for the new social contract by 2012. We will abandon the anachronistic model of fixed employment and embrace a flexible workforce and a fast-changing work environment. To that end, health care insurance would be independent of employers and be affordable, available, and portable for all. Recognizing that only love and not careers are forever, government policy at all levels will embrace continuous training. Tax policy will incent people to invest in their own schooling. Higher education will be accessible to more. The workforce not destined for college will have a ready access to technical education designed to provide and sustain employability. Outdated work rules will be clarified to reflect the new social contract and context. This would provide both protection and certainty for those who choose to work from home or in other non-traditional modes. Look ahead with me to 2012. We're going to be in the midst of another long presidential campaign with the Iowa caucuses occurring on New Year's Eve. If we've made no progress on the essential elements of the new social contract by then, our global competitiveness will have significantly declined in the intervening 4 years. The charges and countercharges among the candidates will center on who lost the jobs war, who lost access to a middle-class life. Social progress requires a solid economic base. It is time for the hard work to begin now, and thank you for the opportunity to be with you all here.
I'll operate from the podium just so that I can see the audience when we turn there. Thank you both very much for setting us off in just the right direction. If the 2011, I guess, caucuses really are on New Year's Eve, if Iowa's not a dry state, it occurs to me that'll be an important moment in our national politics. I just wanted to ask one or two questions to get us started. It seemed to me you were both arguing that the economic changes undermining the old social contract have essentially already occurred, and that cultural and social changes following from those economic changes are already well advanced. And yet you both observe the policies of this country remain far behind, and indeed that there isn't even an articulated vision fully accepted even by either of the two major political parties about how to address that gap. So I just wanted to ask you each to talk about why you think that's so. I'm reminded of a discussion we had with someone we'll hear from later, Mark Schmidt at New America recently, where he was talking about how constituencies for change in the post-war period were easy to identify: demobilized veterans, the labor force of an industrialized economy that was experiencing rapid growth. And so there were natural constituencies in our polity that could articulate arguments for this kind of contract, the old one. But what are the constituencies for successful change now, and what are the arguments that will bring business and labor and government together around some version of the vision that you each articulated?
Well, I mean, I think there's a problem in the sense that we still think of business as American and not business as global. And I think, you know, you could imagine at one moment of history, quote, business and labor coming together as if, you know, they were a national force, and now we have labor sort of stuck nationally, which is a different problem, and capital is and companies are global. So I think it's complicated because, you know, we've been involved in better health care together, Carl and I, and there, you know, a number of people, when we talk about this, is that America can't be the only nation on earth that puts the price of health care on the cost of its products when our competitors don't. It's a stupid economic plan, you know, as well as a moral crisis. You know, there's certain one of our business leaders who get nervous about that because it's sort of looking like they're pro-American, and they're global companies now, and they're uneasy, you know, with looking. So I just think that's a complication that we have here. Obviously, politics follows. They never lead on most situations, although there's always rare politicians that, you know, kind of get out there. But I do think it is a moment that is going to require forces outside the government to come together and figure this out, which is why conferences like this are more than just conferences. I think they're the breeding grounds of the kind of partnership and thinking that really need to take place to push government, you know, to get to where it needs to be. Because what we're seeing is exactly the reverse. Government's being pushed to be protectionist and racist in terms of anti-immigrant, which is the other reaction to insecurity we see in our country.
We also have no well-articulated, easy-to-understand vision that the public and opinion leaders are capable of embracing. This is a complicated topic. Look at your own briefs. Look at speeches that we give, with the exception of Andy's. These are tough for people to comprehend, tough for people to absorb, and we have I don't think we have anybody articulating this in a simple, easy to understand the benefits, and we scare people. One of the things that neither Andy or I had time to talk about today is that there's a whole lot of people under the old social contract who kind of like the outcome of it. It was pretty good for them, and they're not real happy by all this talk of the new social contract. So we do have a large, well-funded constituency who we haven't managed to figure out to talk to them about the transition from old to new, which I think is the second factor.
If there were elements that were relatively easy to distill in each of your speeches, I suppose there would be portability and universality, and as mechanisms to achieve lots of other complicated goals. Could each of you describe what role you think government should play in structuring portability and universality? Do you have a sketch in mind, specifically in reference to healthcare and pension systems?
Coward. I think the government plays several critical roles. Depending on the system that we choose to use to put healthcare out there, at the very least, it's an enforcement arm of things like mandates and so on. Primarily, probably it plays an important role as a collector and redistributor of funds to make health care available to all. Probably doesn't play a role in the direct provision of health care except for certain populations that it may be the only avenue possible to put health care delivery systems in play. I think a more fundamental role that government has to play is to define the rules of the game. What are the rules that we're going to engage, each other within? How are we going to approach, pensions and so on? And I think that in many cases the mechanisms will work themselves out. But in the process of doing so, we're going to obsolete several government institutions who will also be fighting for their very existence along the way.
It's almost like issue by issue, we're going to have different roles here, and I think we need to also conceptualize ways that government simply isn't a legislator. I think what the most interesting thing about the sovereign wealth funds are they're, countries acting like companies, like they're acting like Citigroup. They're financiers, but they're really a government, which, as we all remember, we wouldn't let our government do with Social Security. Invest the money. Somehow that was wrong because we would have a distorted view of the economy, but now we're letting Abu Dhabi and China do the same thing we won't permit America to do, which is just an irony of the moment. But in healthcare, I think government's strongest role is as a purchaser. They are a huge purchaser of services, and I don't think they've conceptualized that role particularly well, and Congress has prevented them at times from conceptualizing that role. But I think in the end, the government's going to arrange it. It's going to set the floors and the minimums. It's going to allow us to gain the best experience that's involved, and most importantly, it's going to set the rules for finance and quality and transparency and interoperability, things that don't naturally, certainly the market have not produced right now. And and clearly in things like pension, having a huge pool to create annuities, which is all in some ways defined benefit pensions are just huge pools that can actually, Dallas Salisbury could tell you how we actuarially divide the pools up, and who divides, whether they arrange it and do it, whether they sub it out, as they do in other things to a private sector groups of people who meet certain standards. I think, they do have to set the rules here of the next iteration and not just see themselves passing bills.
So one last extension of that discussion. Andy, you had this very powerful and easily graspable account of how the globalization of corporations changes their interests and their character in reference to traditional ways of thinking about corporations, but also in reference to traditional ways of thinking about countries and borders. And Carl, you referred to how corporations, because of their global character, feel constrained when asked to act in a national context, possibly. So then, what are the implications of that for the provision or the participation in the provision of pension and health care benefits by corporations, do you think?
The global and U.S. Dichotomy, I think, is less pronounced than it may be apparent. We operate in 40 countries, and as a head of a global corporation, you can't articulate a policy where the United States wins to the loss of another country, another one of your operations. But all of us who are global CEOs want all of the economies of all of the countries in which we operate to be operating at peak efficiency, to be doing well, and to be competitive. And so rather, even the heads of French, Chinese, or other companies want the U.S. economy to be doing well. Nobody wins if the U.S. economy doesn't do well. It's a large market. It's a key to many of our global companies. So I think that we articulate policies instead of a U.S. win and somebody else losing. It's how do we get the most out of, outside of the U.S. Secondly, in terms of lots of our social policies, the U.S. lags significantly behind. We're down to just a small handful of countries who choose to do health care the way we do. And so we're just damaging U.S. competitiveness, and we're damaging, the U.S. marketplace by persisting. And so I don't think it's an issue of a benefit like a pension or a health care or other benefit coming at the loss of another country. It's what do we do to maximize the U.S. marketplace, the U.S. economy.
And I'd just add that I think there's actually an opportunity here because, what companies like Walmart would say to me, competing in a global economy, we can make money in countries that have national health insurance systems or national pension schemes because we've now learned that when the playing field is level, we compete equally with everyone else. And so I think the more and more we see global leaders arise, not just from the U.S., and the more we see U.S. exist in other countries, the more people look around and say, the world doesn't end. This isn't socialized medicine. There aren't long lines. There are ways to deal with some of these things differently. And I think, that may have a more positive effect. But I don't think, we're going to see, like we do with the American National Association of Manufacturers, the same kind of nationalistic tendencies on the part of our employers. Because I think there's one thing, I think Carl's right, that this is the biggest market and no one wants to mess around. On the other hand, no one wants to be so nationalistic that they're not welcome in other markets as well.
Let's turn to the audience with questions. If you'd wait for the microphone, sir, there.
Bacon from the Council on Competitiveness. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Sam.
I want to make a comment about what you said and then ask you a question. The comment is, let's not confuse education and learning. It seems to me that people need constantly, because of technological change, to learn, whether it's because they're getting a college degree, whether it's because they're getting a certification, because they're doing better on the job. And I think that is implicit and ought to be explicit in a new social contract. My question is different. Here you've described an economic universe which the connection between the individual and the employer is deteriorating to the point where the individual has responsibility, much greater responsibility for learning, for pensions, et cetera. Yet unions don't organize individuals. It seems to me there's an enormous potential for unions to provide services to individuals. Let me give you two suggestions. Unions could provide the mother of all information websites on educational opportunities and quality around the country. And the recent agreement in the auto industry that made unions responsible for health care also makes them responsible for informing the consumer, which in health care is an enormously difficult problem, but for which we have a lot of technology to do it. So my question is, you, as probably, as far as I can tell, the most enlightened labor leader in the country.
Now you're going to get me in trouble. Go ahead.
I know, but you got yourself in trouble without my help.
Touche. And I'm very interested in the distributive function, not even for union members, but for everyone. And so I think it totally makes sense, when we think about social policy, to incentivize, institutions, organizations, AARP. We're working on something called Quavisory, which is a sort of AARP for 18 to 35-year-olds that will allow them to take their health insurance from job to job, or more probably their parents can pay for their health insurance when they don't, and then go dormant at the time. They get a job with health insurance, and that will begin to deal with some of those job and learning skills of where they find them. We'll advocate on certain issues that are more important to young people. It is sort of the forerunner or precursor of something much bigger, as are VIVAs. But we don't have investment capital, as part of the issue here. I mean, if Carl's going to start a new venture, these are enormously expensive operations, to create, and people like Steve Case have proven that even with a lot of money, in revolutions and stuff, doesn't necessarily mean you're successful. So I do think it is a question of, yes, it is an appropriate role, not the distributive one, which is, I think, primary. Two is, I think we should think about, when we create social policy, how do we incentivize unions to go there, or organizations, associations to go there, and not into, making work rules at the workplace that are complicated. So I think you're right. I just think it has to be in addition to other things.
This woman in the, gentleman in the back with the card up there.
Yes, good morning. My name is Ben Korovsky. I'm from Venezuela, so I can certainly attest what happens, what chaos ensues from not having a working social contract. But having
lots of oil helps.
No, it doesn't really help. It doesn't help. But having been an executive director, I was frequently at the World Bank, I was frequently confronted with the problem of the governance issue. And I always said that splitting up the shares at the board, executive board, between countries didn't get us any further any longer. So if we really wanted to scale up governance, we had to give one share to the migrant communities and one share to the multinationals, and really take it up to the global. You touched on that point, so I just want to make a question. Can you really afford to look for a local social contract, or don't you have to put your eyes now on really striving for a global social contract? Thank you.
I mean, I think there are limitations, for all the reasons you said, to a national social contract. But I think there's a lot of work that can be done, so we should not, think that it's not time enormously well spent. I think the more interesting question globally is, are we making a social contract with government, or are we making a social contract with companies? Because more and more, as I said, the companies are making the rules of the global economy. Ask France about its employment policies. Ask Germany about, jobs being played off between Poland and Germany based on, certain functions that are played. And, think about the sovereign wealth funds as companies, not countries. And I think there really is an issue of whether all the NGOs, all civil society, whether, if we think back to the anti-apartheid movement, where the Sullivan principles at least were a framework that everyone thought about investing in South Africa, could we create a global framework, that is nation sensitive, so it's not one standard around the world, but has a set of principles like we're talking about here, that everyone, environmentalists, union leaders, the ILO, governments, could all work together on, and particularly pension fund investors, who I think, have a lot of opportunities in a global economy, shape behavior.
There's macro limits as to how much you could choose to spend or not spend on, on elements of a social contract. But if you look at the United States, back to, one of the topics that driving us in healthcare in particular, what we have is a system where we're spending more per person than any other industrialized country and achieving less macro benefits. So the issue for us as we look at redefining social contract in a lot of cases isn't about decreasing competitiveness by raising costs, but it's picking a more competitive form or a more efficient form to go about delivering benefits. And we've introduced a lot of inefficiency by trying to hang on to the old forms of the social contract. So at least inside the United States, it's not an issue of raising total cost as distributing what we're spending, differently. But on a macro basis, you will run into countries become less competitive if they spend more on these types of benefits than other countries do. But I've watched over periods of time it evens out, and you have same topic being debated in areas of pollution control and so on. What are global standards, and then what then becomes, you know, the company's, the country's decisions.
We have time for one last question. The woman there on the left.
Hello, I'm Charlotte Frank. I'm with McGraw-Hill. It happens to be a small world, but Kelly Services provides some very good support for us, but that's not the basis for this question. One of the things I know that we're talking about change in this new social contract, and because there are outdated work rules. That's what I've heard you say. Change is not easy. The only one who really wants to be changed, as you know, is a baby. Seriously, though. We're trying to change a system. That's not easy because we've had these outdated work rules. The issue I would like you to address is the outdated educational system, the kinds of things that we need. In order for this globalization to be very real, is it an outdated educational system? But as I looked around, I see the heads going this way. But in order to do that, we're going to need our young people to have some sense about financial literacy, economic literacy. They're going to have a sense about this whole international world. They have to understand the culture of this international world. And if we're going to build a new internet highway system, people are going to have to understand what being an entrepreneur is and what kind of entrepreneurial system. This is the kind of stuff that will help our country, all our countries grow. It's how you nurture and provide the climate and the emphasis for this kind of growth. I know I heard you both speak about it. What do you think is necessary for these kinds of changes to take place? And I sometimes say I don't need this because I still have a cafeteria voice, even though I'm a senior vice president at McGraw-Hill.
I'll start if you. McGraw-Hill, far better known as a publisher, but actually a leader in educational services, so question very timely. McGraw-Hill also a leader, by the way, in trying to work with a distributed workforce and has run afoul of the work rules that we've been trying to help clean up with at Kelly Services. It's very hard operating a new economy with old work rules. You know, the question of, and as individuals over here were talking about education versus learning, I think in the United States we still have, so to begin with, a problem that we view education as a discrete event. You know, it happens in stages, you get to graduate, and then you think, God, that stuff's all behind you, and now you can get on doing other things. And part of the shift that we both have talked about is how do you get more into a continuous mode so that people are able to keep retraining, re-educating. And so I don't think it's a question of what's in the curriculum at this point in time, but a question of how do we engage people in a process of being able to continue to learn, to continue to retrain over time in an environment where companies aren't going to take that role on for them. To that end, others of us have begun advocating a system of tax incentives so that you're able to engage, invest in education post-college, post-high school, still continue to receive incentives to do so at a time when your company is not doing it. And the debate over what should and shouldn't be in the curriculum is for people with a much different focus in life than I have.
So I just say, one is we should, including me, stop kicking work rules around, because when only 7% of the American workforce in the private sector has unions, it's sort of hard to kick it around for the other 93%, as if somehow that 7% is driving the economy, not the other 93%. So there's a problem about unions, and there may have been a problem about work rules, but it has very little impact, on the overall economy right now. In fact, the real impact is the absence of union is causing the greatest amount of inequality we've ever seen in our history, and union workers still happen to have 50%, 30% higher wages doing the same job, twice as likely to have health care. There is a redistribution function that unions play that no one really wants to deal with because there's ideology involved in it legitimately as well. Two is I think that, the education system's failed pretty much in our country. We've probably invested, more money than whatever, particularly K-12, and then we've made college way too expensive. So, I think it requires, redesign, and yet I don't think anybody's really found, other than having small schools are better than big schools. I don't think we have sort of a across-the-board empirical way that we all could say if we only did these things, life would be better. But I do agree with Carl. This is about lifelong learning and skill training, not just graduating people from high school or college, one. Two is I think we have totally underutilized, and I know it hasn't yet found its place, but kids are on technology. They don't like to be talked to. If I want my son, I text message him. I don't call him and chat with him on the phone. And we have an education system that's still based on sort of oral, preaching and learning in a world where people go home and learn on their computer. And until we integrate what I think is the greatest resource that's ever existed for education that can differentiate, you want to talk about individual education plans, which kids who have special needs get. Everybody could have an individual education plan with a computer, because a computer can just respond to you way differently. And I know many people are starting to work on this area, but I just think we're going to need differentiated education where people learn at their own pace. Some people learn by playing video games, and some people learn by listening to music, and some people can play by drawing. I think we have a unique opportunity that this is again where I hope the private sector figures it out, but boy, I'd like a DARPA for education and technology to really see if we could advance this thing way past it. One last point, which is, I think the other problem is I do think we have a lot of entrepreneurial activity in this country, because everybody's not going to be an entrepreneur. But I do think the country doesn't have an investment plan, either a capital investment plan for infrastructure or a job creation investment plan. So I'm always interested when I see states like California pass a bond to do a biotech, right? And think about, why aren't we as a country investing, as a country, as states, as bonds, as government, in creating the next generation of, environmental, opportunities that China and everybody else in the world are going to need to find. Cars that don't run on, combustion engines, things that clean up the environment, coal that burns clean. I mean, I just don't get why we could send a man to the moon, but we can't sort of figure out right in front of us, a new whole area of economic growth, that our country can't make a plan to deal with.
You've both started us on just the right path, and the panels ahead will break down some of this synthesis and look at the sectors that we've glided over. But for now, I just ask the audience to join me in thanking you for taking time from your demanding schedules to do this for us.
All right, we're going to seamlessly try to move along here, and I definitely want to join Steve in thanking Andy and Carl for those very compelling comments, and we'll bring our other panelists up here. Joe Minerick, Michael Calabrese, Thomas Cohen, Donna Klein, and the opportunity is really to focus on the employer's role here and give an opportunity to react to some of what we just heard, and also laying out some of the issues for the employers going forward. So let's just, I think everyone can find their seats. I also want to point out to everybody something that's in your packets, which is a piece by our colleague Glenn Nichols, as Steve mentioned, a sustainable healthcare system for all Americans. And this piece lays out a proposal to move our healthcare system away from an employer-based system and towards one that tracks the individual and the worker. It's been very influential. His insights have been drawn on by leading policymakers, and including Senators Wyden and Bennett, who have a legislative proposal. It includes an individual purchase requirement, the individual mandate that we've heard so much about, as well as ideas about lowering costs and improving quality in a reform delivery system. As well as a very innovative way of dealing with this transition to ensure that wages go up during a transition from the employer-based to a more citizen-based system. So that's in your handout, and it's also available on our website. And I'll turn it over to Michael Calabrese now, my colleague, who will handle this first panel on the employer's role.
Good morning. So this immediately follows on Andy and Carl's opening here, and this is really the first of 4 panels today organized around the way America's social contract is organized as an evolving bargain between the four broad sectors of society: households and families, civil society, government, and of course, private sector employers. We see changes in the social contract most clearly as changes in the distribution of resources and responsibility among these four sectors. So, for example, the initial era of industrialization after the Civil War is remembered as a period of laissez-faire, and yet government took far more responsibility for large-scale investments in productive infrastructure and for nurturing infant industries than it does today. Railroads, canals, ports, and urban utilities of the progressive era were all heavily subsidized by government. Perhaps more critically, large-scale business formation and growth was spurred by the legal fiction of incorporation, which limited and spread risk for entrepreneurship and investment to society as a whole. On the other hand, to the extent that there was any safety net for workers and dependents, that responsibility fell to extended families and civil society. Fast forward to the post-World War II social contract, where things were organized quite a bit differently among the sectors. In this era, from the mid-1930s through the late 1970s, government both regulated business and nurtured unions to countervail corporate power. While this occurred to an even greater degree in Europe, under our uniquely American social contract, it was employers who acquired the responsibility for delivering basic benefit security to workers and their families. Health care, pensions, unemployment insurance, and most mid-career training were delivered through the employment relationship. This began almost by accident, at first through collective bargaining, encouraged by a freeze on wage increases during World War II, as well as by the exclusion at that time of health benefits from both income and payroll tax liability. New America fellow Jacob Hacker, who will be speaking a little bit later today, in his book, The Divided Welfare State, has shown that the American welfare state is roughly the same size as the more democratic socialist nations of Northern Europe. The primary difference is that in the U.S., the government entices employers to privatize the delivery of health, pension, and certain other benefits with the carrot of tax subsidies. Alone among advanced nations, our health and pension coverage is premised on voluntary provision by employers and subsidized by more than $300 billion each year in tax expenditures. That's just for health and pension alone. Yet because lower wage workers receive very little, if any, benefit from income tax deductions, and also tend to be more fungible as labor, their employers have little incentive to provide health or other benefits. Today's tax deduction for saving is worth zero to the more than 40 million low-earning taxpayers who have payroll tax liability, but who don't have any income tax liability to offset. As a result, our employer-based social contract for basic benefits has never come close to universal coverage. Health and pension coverage peaked in the late 1970s. Only 43% of private sector workers participate in an employer-sponsored retirement plan today, down sharply from near 50% as recently as the year 2000. And although many young and lower-wage workers choose not to save in 401ks, only 57% of private sector employees work at a firm that sponsors any retirement plan at all. A larger share of Americans still receive health insurance through work, but this too is steadily eroding and bifurcating in a way that reinforces income inequality and makes our leading industries less competitive. Just since 2000, the percentage of employers offering health benefits has declined from 69 to 60%. Employers maintaining coverage cope by cutting their share of costs, but this pushes many workers, particularly low-wage workers, to decline coverage as their share becomes unaffordable. At the same time, it's increasingly clear that the benefit burden on U.S. business is a drag on productivity and profitability in an increasingly competitive and globalized economy. The cost per worker in firms that offer insurance is 11.4% of payroll, 13% in what's left of our manufacturing sector, a level that is nearly 5 times as high as it was in the 1960s, a kind of a golden age of competitiveness for us, and 2 to 3 times the payroll tax rate among most of our major trading partners, with the exception of France. Another big cost to society is a two-way job lock that makes the labor market less mobile, less flexible, and more inefficient. First, workers who need health coverage the most because of family or pre-existing medical conditions are deterred from switching jobs, from going freelance or starting a firm of their own. I think Carl talked about that, particularly with respect to the emerging free agent nation. Indeed, the high cost of health insurance is one of the greatest obstacles to small business creation and growth. Second, employers have strong incentives to pile on overtime on existing workers or to maximize the use of part-time, temp, and contract workers rather than take on the overhead of health, pension, and unemployment payments. These are a few of the reasons why New America has been advocating citizen-based benefits. That is, a wholesale shift of responsibility for basic benefits from employers to individual workers and government. This foundation of basic benefit security and lifelong learning for all workers is increasingly a prerequisite for equal opportunity and upward mobility. Rather than hide the cost of burdening business, we should view health care, retirement security, wage insurance, and retraining as public investments in the conditions required so that all our citizens can invest, take risks, and fully participate in American life. I'll turn it over now to, next up is Donna Klein. And Donna is the president and founder of Corporate Voices.
Mike,
Pardon?
this is a revolt. We're putting Mike first.
Oh,
Tom.
okay.
Tom. Sorry.
Okay, we're,
Okay.
oh, that's right, okay. All right, we're going to have,
This is a worker-based.
we're going to change the order. No problem, this is great. I think we're in descending levels of big pictureism. Next up then will be Professor Tom Koken, who is the George Maverick Bunker Professor of Management at MIT. Tom co-directs both the MIT Workplace Center and its Institute for Work and Employment Research. And among his most recent books are Restoring the American Dream, A Working Family's Agenda for America. And I should notice in your packet there's fuller bios, so we won't tell you all the stellar accomplishments of our speakers.
Good. Thank you, Michael. You just saw democracy at work, so there are some values that have carried forward as we rearrange the order this morning. Good morning. I'm really delighted to be here. I'll even be more delighted if I can get back to Boston to teach my class this afternoon through the snowstorm. So we'll see if the airline industry has some resources and courage to fly back to Boston. This is obviously a very, very important issue. I'm delighted we're seeing gatherings like this, not only here in Washington, but all over the country, debating an issue that I believe will test the historic pragmatism of American society. We've been known as a society that can roll up its sleeves, work across class, interest group divisions to find solutions to critical problems. And I think this is the most critical problem of the day. I won't belabor the elements of the post-war social contract and even some of the elements of the new social contract, because I think Andy and Carl and now Michael have outlined some of those. But I think what I'd like to do is make 4 points. I think it's first important to understand, where did this social contract that evolved after World War II come from? What were the forces that put it in place? Secondly, why did it break down? And then third, turning to the specific issue of our panel, what's the role of employers in rebuilding a social contract that meets the needs of the modern workforce in all of its diversity and all of its change that we've experienced in recent years? And then finally, no social contract. A contract requires multiple parties. And it's not that we are all just individuals. There needs to be leadership and institutions called government, labor, groups in civil society that advocate for particular issues in our workplace that need to come together to work on these issues. So those are the topics that I'd like to try to address very briefly. Let's start with what generated this social contract. It did not come out of some invisible hand of market forces saying that these are the institutional arrangements and the compensation rules and the principles at the workplace that should govern work. It started with the foundation of the New Deal, the very basic minimum standards for wages and work hours and unemployment insurance and workers' compensation and disability and Social Security that laid a foundation that said we will have these minimum standards and then we will provide further legislation to give workers a voice and an opportunity to influence their conditions of work and to gradually and incrementally perhaps improve on those standards through collective bargaining as it was enacted in the New Deal legislation. But it was really, as several have already mentioned, the immediate post-World War II time period, and starting in World War II with the War Labor Board, that developed the basic principles of compensation. In the mid-1940s, in Detroit, there was something called the Treaty of Detroit, where General Motors and the UAW said, we're going to set compensation principles in a way that ties productivity and cost of living to wages. And so you had a formula that allowed wages to move in tandem with the overall growth in productivity and profitability of our economy. Now, this didn't spread automatically across all of the American economy, but it spread because we had growing unions, we had an ability to start to take wages out of competition, we had an ability to spread the basic principles through the fabric of our economy to reach large numbers of the workforce, and we had incentive on progressive employers that were not unionized to match those same kinds of benefits so that they could be competitive and, if necessary, to stay non-union. Those institutional arrangements came out of a balance in society, a balance between business, a balance with labor, a balanced role for government. And something broke down. Something broke down over the time period between the 1940s and today. Indeed, that social contract worked well, so you did see productivity and wages move in tandem up through the 1970s. And then in the 1980s, since 1980, we've seen productivity grow by about 70% in the United States, and we've seen wages for the average worker essentially remain stagnant, with some ups and some downs, but not any real significant wage growth since 1980 for the average worker. Why did this occur? Well, there's no real mystery about this. First, you did see a decline in union power. You saw not only the decline in the numbers of union members, but you also saw a decline in the innovative nature of unions. As unions get backed farther and farther into a corner, now 7.5%, as Andy said, they are less and less able to think creatively and to introduce new concepts, new ways of working, the kind of suggestion that Sam Lincoln mentioned. Many of us have made that suggestion over the years, and you're only seeing slight pockets of innovation in the labor movement because they are fighting for their institutional lives. At the same time that unions declined, in the 1980s we saw a very fundamental shift in the very definition of what corporations in the United States stand for. In the period of more balanced power, you had a notion that corporations needed to provide fair returns to their shareholders, but also meet the needs and interests of their communities and in their employees. That was reinforced and, in fact, disciplined by the countervailing power that existed in society. As that broke down in the 1980s, we saw a revolt, and we saw the contest for corporate control with hostile takeovers, the move, which we now call private equity, but then was called leverage buyouts. Now we see, as Andy said, that we have a situation where it's taken for granted in the way in which we teach corporate finance, the way in which we think about the role of the corporation, that they only exist to maximize shareholder, owner, or investor wealth. That leads to a very unbalanced society and one that has to be revisited if we are to move forward. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum, and you know all about the competitive pressures and the role of technology and the role of deregulation in some of our key markets, but it also occurred in a period where I think we had institutional inertia in the face of a markedly changing economy, but also a changing workforce. And Carl mentioned some of it this morning, the free agent nation. Yes, that's part of it, but I think a bigger part of it is something that I'm sure we will hear more of today, and certainly in the panel this afternoon, the fact that we now have parents in the workforce, dual parents. We have a situation where work and family are now more tightly integrated and coupled because both parents are in the workforce, single parents are expected to be in the workforce. We have a very changed workforce that needs to be addressed as part of a new social contract, yet too many of our institutions still think about work in the workforce as that old male breadwinner in a stable job for a long period of time. So these are some of the things that led to the breakdown in the social contract. If those are the breakdowns, then what is it that we need to put in place? You'll hear more about this today. You've already heard that the very basic notions that workers still expect, that hard work and effort and loyalty should be sufficient to allow them to move up in their standard of living, to get very basic wages and health insurance, and to live the American dream of being able to at least match, if not improve, on the lifestyle that they grew up in their parents' households. That, I think, is still our challenge and our responsibility. But we have to obviously do things in new ways to meet those expectations at work. We do have to do all of the things that were mentioned. Think about fixing health insurance and divorcing it from the employer-centered model, releasing pension plans from the same kind of firm-centric system that we've had in the post-war period for some of the reasons that Michael mentioned a few minutes ago. And so we need to fix those problems. We need to create a world where workers can move more readily across jobs that have the kind of resources and the kind of lifelong learning that is necessary. And if that's the case, then what do we expect? What do we expect from employers, and how do we get there? Well, I think it is time to revisit what employers can do and what they can't do in order to contribute to a social contract. What they can't do is they can't compete on the basis of labor costs or minimizing costs in a world where wages and labor costs vary so markedly across not only the world, obviously in a global economy, but also here in the United States, where you have new entrants coming in at much lower cost situations than existing firms. And so we have to hold firms accountable for doing what many have already learned, and that is we have to treat employees as assets. We have to compete on the basis of innovation, on productivity improvement, on quality improvement, and on being able to be one step ahead on the technological frontier so that there's an incentive to invest in human capital. We have seen this through work that has been done now in multiple industries, that there are ways to compete on the basis of innovation, technology, and investment in human capital that can create and sustain good jobs. In the airline industry, all you have to do is compare the experience of an organization like Southwest, or if you don't like to use the Southwest model because they're somehow different, then look at Continental Airlines versus some of the others that have competed in recent years by simply lowering wage costs to the very lowest common denominator, going into bankruptcy, severing their responsibilities for pensions and so on. The same is in the retail industry, Costco versus Walmart. We can go from industry to industry and see the same kinds of variation. We have the know-how to compete on the basis of innovation and high-quality jobs. We just have to hold corporations accountable for doing so. To do that, we have to get back to a situation where firms define their responsibilities in society as one that is going beyond wealth maximization for shareholders and hold them accountable for meeting responsibilities to individuals and to communities. That's not going to happen simply on the basis of good corporate leadership and sense of social responsibility. To get there, corporations need to be held accountable. They need to be held accountable by government, and they need to be held accountable by labor and other institutions in civil society. So to get to the situation where employers can accept their responsibilities in return for some relief on health care and on those benefits that they can't any longer provide, means that we have to start to rebuild a government policy, not back to the New Deal, but a situation where government policy encourages firms, supports those firms that are engaged in the progressive forms of competition, support those firms that are investing in their employees and in new technology, and then hold all firms accountable for meeting the minimum standards that we expect in terms of safety and health and other basic conditions, both here and abroad. We've learned how to do that. We see that in global supply chains, companies like Nike and others can hold their contractors accountable if there is enough transparency in the way in which they are shown to be operating in the United States and in other countries. So government can play a role as a catalyst for innovation, supporting those that are leading the way and holding those accountable that are at the minimum standards. And then finally, what about labor organizations? Well, it is clear that we need a resurgence in the labor movement in the United States, but not in the mirror image of the form that we are losing as it continues to shrink. We have to have a labor movement that is value added, that provides the networking and the linking of people to jobs and opportunity, that provides lifelong learning, and that works in partnership with employers where employers are willing to reciprocate. That's a vision for the future that says we can have a return to a situation where there are institutions in our labor market that hold each other accountable. If we do that, then corporations will play a progressive role in rebuilding a social contract, because they will be held accountable not just for good work in terms of leadership, but also by the countervailing influence of a progressive government policy and a progressive labor movement. That's the vision that I think we can achieve if we put our minds to work and we roll up our sleeves and we start to respect each other for the roles that we play in society. I believe we will regain a reputation for a pragmatic society that meets the needs of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Next up, we have Donna Klein, who is president and founder of Corporate Voices for Working Families, which is a nonprofit that advances policy changes in government, in business on issues such as worker flexibility, work-family balance, family economic stability, after-school care, and so on. And Donna is formerly Vice President of Workplace Effectiveness at Marriott International here in the Washington, D.C. area. Donna?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks to the New America Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here. The need for a new social contract was really one of the key driving forces for the creation of Corporate Voices for Working Families about 7 years ago. It was clear to me, as well as many other corporations on the leading edge of work and family policy, that what we had was what we were going to have, and we needed to create something new and different to move forward. Corporate Voices is a coalition of 55 best practice companies. As Mike said, we're trying to increase private sector participation in the public policy debate and also trying to influence new and better policy within the companies themselves. I'm going to talk about this issue of employers and what the employer role is, actually by sharing specific quotes from employers and some recent research that has been done with major employers on this very issue. So I'm going to share some thoughts really about the state of play, if you will, about a new social contract. To begin, I want to talk a little bit about a piece of research that Boston College did, interviewed 50 C-suite executives, CEOs and COOs, if you will, CFOs, chief financial officers, et cetera. These 50 individuals were from 25 big best practice companies. And what we found was a continuum of opinion, a very, very wide continuum of opinion about this need for a new social contract and what the employer's role it really is. The good news is there is agreement on the role of business has changed. There's also agreement, however, that business is being burdened, their word, not mine, with new responsibilities. And those are the responsibilities we're talking about in this room. There's also agreement that the old model, the Milton Friedman model of business, the business of business is business, is no longer totally valid. I want to underline totally, because again, that's their word, not mine. But you do see movement on the part of CEOs about exactly what the role of business is. And there also is agreement that business interests and social interests can coexist within a company. So that's a start. You've seen they're acknowledging certainly some change. I want to remind us all that these kinds of changes take time. We hearken back. I can certainly point back to my own career of 40 years in the private sector, when we started to talk about equal opportunity for women and minorities, when we started to talk about diversity. You saw the same reluctance, if you will, on the part of corporations to embrace these changes, but nonetheless, you find that now it's mainstream. So I'm hopeful about this. This is not in any way a conversation that I hope will be discouraging. I look at it as encouraging. Corporations do recognize they cannot be passive on societal issues any longer, that they must engage. But the question for them is, how should they engage? This same research project delivered really mixed opinions about how far companies should go. There's a nervousness that companies will become so burdened that they can't be agile and fast enough to keep up with market changes. And the charge from corporations to the public sector is, NGOs, et cetera, is that really the NGOs don't really understand how important that agility is, how important that flexibility is for them to be agile, because otherwise they'll go out of existence. Markets change very fast. At the other end, CEOs agree that companies, again, must be part of the public debate because their workforce has changed dramatically, and the stability of the workforce is at stake. There's also agreement that progress on the monetary side, these are their quotes, should result in progress for other sectors of society. In other words, they do owe something back because of their gains. But again, the continuum is wide. One CEO of a very well-known professional services firm, direct quote is, the duty of a CEO is more than the creation of wealth for the company, and that's a direct quote. On the other hand, to give you an example of how wide the continuum is, the CEO of a leading consumer food products company said, I quote, "When you say companies should give back, be careful. That implies companies have been exploiting society. We have nothing to give back. We've given back before, and plenty." And the survey goes on. It's an interesting piece. You should look it up. It goes on to talk about 10 styles of corporate social responsibility. A continuum, again. On one end is reluctant participation by corporations in social policy issues. And number 10 is, of course, the highest level would be business leadership in social issue policy implementation. We all know what we do, all corporations share one common opinion, fair or unfair, and that is, number one, partnering with NGOs is going to be critical to get us to the next phase. But in order for that to happen, new behaviors are going to have to be learned by all sectors. And NGOs don't exhibit at this point in time the amount of discipline, efficiency, and accountability as the private sector does. And until they do, that partnership is going to be very, very hard and very, very difficult to get to. So, so I was talking to somebody about this recently, and obviously one of the examples that comes up is Katrina. And this woman said to me, if Katrina relief was in the hands solely of corporations, there would have been, $350 million FEMA trailers sitting unoccupied as well. I don't think so, based on my 40 years. There's certainly what could have been overspending, there certainly could have been inefficiencies, but if that happened, in the old corporate parlance, heads would have rolled. It would have happened one time to one person. And I really don't think it would have been that efficiency, and obviously I'm biased, I'm a private sector person. But when we do reach the point that corporations trust NGOs to be, Tom mentioned, accountable, NGOs need to be accountable as well. The government needs to be accountable as well, and I think corporations don't see accountability on the part of other sectors as being anywhere near how they are accountable to their own stakeholders. Corporations do work, that partnership is important. They do work with NGOs now, but they don't like it too much. They'd much rather work with private sector because of the reasons I just mentioned. They don't like working with NGOs. They perceive them as being slower, too inclusive. Everybody has to be at the table. Everybody has to agree. And it's not the way that a private sector business operates normally. I'm pointing this out because I want to underline the fact that new behaviors are going to be required by all sectors, not just corporations. In a piece of work we did, Corporate Voices did, Are They Ready to Work?, which measured 450 employers' perceptions of 20 skills for first job holders. 10 were applied and 10 were core skills or basic skills. And what we found out, based on these 450 employers' nationwide representative sample, is that they aren't ready for their first job. 100% of high school graduates they marked as deficient. Like 50% of two-year college graduates were deficient in 50% of the skills, and four-year graduates were also deficient in particularly written language and oral communications. But all were deficient in work ethics and personal responsibility, if you will. So the applied skills trumped the core skills. We then went on to ask employers, who needs to fix this? And this is the traditional response you would expect. The employers did not say, we have a role. On a very wide continuum, employers accepted responsibility, maybe in the middle of the continuum, but they pointed to the education system, they pointed to teachers, they pointed to the government, they pointed to NGOs before, of course, they pointed to themselves, again, to illustrate what their preference would be if they had a choice. And considering that, you must understand that corporations, in terms of philanthropic giving, investment in education by corporate foundations has been at the top of the list for decades and is still at the top of the list. I don't think it's first place any longer, but it's still there. And corporations also are investing $60 billion annually. Doing training overall, a very big percentage of that is remedial training. In other words, training that needs to be done before they can even begin to learn the job. So they're making these tremendous, tremendous investments, but still they're reluctant to participate in exactly figuring out how to fix the system, and the fact is it's hard. And they want somebody else to step up and do it if they can. The Conference Board did a survey just early this year, 2007. They tested their whole body of CEOs, which is hundreds of CEOs, on what were their top 10 challenges in the next year in 2008. All sectors of the corporations, so the companies over $5 billion, companies $1 billion to $5 billion in revenue, and companies with less than $1 billion in revenue. Top 3 challenges were identical for all 3 segments. The first thing that they're challenged about is excellence in execution. The second is steady top-line growth. The third is their ability for top management to execute strategy. The fourth is profit growth, and the fifth is finding qualified management talent. On the list, and I think this is good news, is corporate social responsibility and corporate reputation, which is really what we're talking about in terms of the employer's role in new social contract. The good news, it was on the list for all segments. It ranged in the area of between 6 and 8, but what we need to do, obviously, is elevate that on the list to get them really very, very engaged. Again, if you get a CEO in a quiet corner, everyone on a one-on-one conversation, they will agree that their roles have changed. The fact that there is no clarity on what their roles should be is very, very bothersome to them. Net of the Conference Board study, 80% of the CEOs said they should be involved in social policy. only 40% of them say they are involved in social policy. So a big delta there. A new social contract is necessary, one that has shared purpose and values. We all know that. Business must play a role. We all know that. Business knows that. I think this opportunity today, what's important about this is not to do a blame game. This is really not about, for me, debate or blaming any particular sector for where we are and why we've failed and why we're in the position we are, but to really build together. And the building together is going to require new behaviors on the part of all sectors, not just corporations. Thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Our final panelist, before we turn to you all for questions and so on, is Joe Minurek. Joe is the chief economist and, or I'm sorry, I should say senior vice president and director of research at the Committee for Economic Development. I'm thinking of his many years on Capitol Hill, where, among other things, Joe was chief economist and policy director of the House Budget Committee and also served at the Office of Management and Budget as associate director for economic policy. Joe.
Hi, let me speak very briefly, I hope, about my own agenda, which I got from the organizers, which was to be relatively specific about some policy issues relevant to the social contract, and that's good for me. I'm not a philosopher, I'm a mechanic. So what I'd like to do is get into some of those issues. But in terms of the philosophical backdrop or the real world backdrop, why is the social contract changing? You've heard it already. There are substantial changes in the pattern of employment, which extends both to the number of years people stay on an individual job, the number of job changes during a career, and also we're expecting some changes in the duration of working lives. If you have more changes in jobs, more frequent changes over the course of a career, that obviously is going to say that the old lifetime relationship between employers and employees, whatever role government plays, has got to change because that lifetime relationship just isn't there anymore. What is driving that? I think that Carl Camden was very close to the point that technological change plays a very important role in what has been happening in the way that the employment relationship has been changing. I think, however, that really one step before that, we have to recognize is an intensity of competition that we see these days. That competition, I recall once on Capitol Hill hearing Alan Greenspan testify and saying competition economically is one of the most wonderful things. It's a tremendously productive force, except when it applies to me. And that's really how I think everybody feels. It's wonderful when you have a wider range of goods and services available to you at lower prices. Of course, it's terrible when that means that you yourself have to think about changing your own approach, whether that means you need to undergo more training, whether that means you need to work harder or faster, or think about even changing career. But that competition has been driving a lot of what has been going on in the workplace and in the relationship between employers and employees, with government also playing a role. The fact that this employment relationship has been changing has taken certain aspects of this social contract, the manifestations of the social contract, and made them much more difficult. One of those is health care. And the changes that have become most difficult, where these mismatches have become most prominent, are, of course, the ones that flash in your eyes. I talk sometimes about the Willie Sutton theory of policy making, and for those of you who are not familiar with Willie Sutton, he was a very prominent and productive and successful bank robber going back about 80 years, and somebody asked Willie Sutton, "Why did you rob banks?" And his answer was, "Because that's where the money is." Well, that's why people have been interested in health care policy recently. That is, in fact, where the money is. CED trustees have looked at that issue very recently and have come to the conclusion that yes, competition is a very wonderful thing, but it doesn't always work. And healthcare is one area where unbridled competition very clearly doesn't always work. One of the aspects of competition, given the current relationships among employers and employees and government with the role of private insurers in there, has been a breakdown of risk pooling, the problem of cherry picking, where the very young and the very healthy can do very well in an unbridled competitive process. Those who are not so young and not so healthy are the ones who get left out and very often are left behind. We had the opportunity to have extended conversations with many of our CED members and some other business leaders around the country. I can tell you that when we talked about healthcare, there's been a lot of difference of opinion. CED recently issued a statement on healthcare, which you can find at ced.org. One thing I can tell you, the discussions we had were not unanimous. There were differences of opinion. But I can tell you that there was one question that I could ask business leaders, and I would always get the same answer. And that question was, how, given the current trends in the healthcare marketplace, are you going to provide healthcare coverage for your employees 5 or 10 years down the road? And everybody gave me exactly the same answer, and that answer was, I don't know. I had one business human resources person tell me, I always thought up until this moment, or up until very recently, that I knew what the solution to the healthcare problem was. I knew what the next big thing was going to be. Now I have no idea what the solution to the problem is. Business leaders, we found, want to be there for employees. They want to be involved in their employees' lives. They believe that healthcare is an important part of their employees' lives, and they want to be there in healthcare. The problem is they don't know how to make the system work anymore. The evidence that we have problems is very obvious. The percentage of employers offering coverage has declined substantially over about the last 10 years, down from about 69 to 61%. The absolute number of people covered by employer coverage has gone down. The population is growing, employment is growing, the workforce is growing, but the number of people covered by employer coverage has been going down. That's clearly an evidence that we have a problem. CED worked on this issue and came down very near to where the New America Foundation has, which is to say we think that what we need is a non-employment-based system. What we need is something like the federal employees' health benefits system, but for everybody, which is to say you need a market organizer to make competition work. You need a menu of choices so that every person can choose the health insurance that he believes is what he wants, not what the employer thinks is what that person ought to have. We also believe that you need a credit available to everyone so that that person can choose at least the low-priced quality health care plan with a market maker setting standards, which is very important, like the Office of Personnel Management sets for the federal employees plan, with no out-of-pocket costs so that everyone can afford coverage. Another area where you have a mismatch between employer and employees, institutions where you used to have a lifetime relationship between the employer and the employee, is the area of retirement coverage. It made a lot of sense to have a defined benefit plan being offered by an employer when there was a lifetime relationship. It's much harder to run a defined benefit plan when workers change from jobs to job. CED, about 10 years ago, when people were talking seriously about finding a solution to Social Security, did a study and issued a statement on that program. The conclusion we came to, however, and I think this is very important, is that even if you want to have portability at the employer level so that people can move from job to job, and even if that means that it's much easier and makes more sense to have a defined contribution plan at the employer level, there must be a defined benefit base upon which individuals can plan. The slogan may be, if you want to hope for the best, but you have to plan for the worst, you need a defined benefit base for people to operate. And so CED issued a statement on making Social Security solvent in the long run. There would be an employer role, but it is important that there be that defined benefit base for everyone. I just got the sign to stop. I think I'm pretty close to the end of what I have to say. I welcome your comments and look forward to hearing from you.
All right, thank you to the panel. We can open it up. We have time for a few questions. I'm going to take kind of a moderator's perspective to put Donna, I guess in particular, on the spot. Raise one thing a little more explicitly. We spent a lot of time, talking about relieving employers of burdens, particularly on benefits, which today, among other problems, tend to be all or nothing, whether you're full-time. Of course, then there's, for families, for working families, time is a huge stress, and children today are much more complex investments, as I
More than public sector, at least private sector, probably more than government, for sure. We estimate maybe 50% of all corporations do some kind of flexibility. The smaller the corporation, the more informal it can be. Sometimes informal is better. We did a major research study last year on the business impact of flexibility, and we shared with the public proprietary internal research data from 29 big best practice companies about what the return on investment was for flexibility. And in turn, the investment is, the return is very robust. Increases in human capital, increases in talent management scores, and increases in real productivity scores. So we feel increased flexibility is an imperative for the future. It certainly is the #1 choice in all corporate research. If you research employees about what do they want most from their employer, they want control over hours. And I think it's moved a long way and will continue to move a long way. As we get into, certainly all of our companies that are part of Corporate Voices do have prorated benefits for reduced work weeks and flexibility and part-timers, et cetera. That isn't true with all companies. I think that's also hopefully moving as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and be sure to tell us, who you are with. Yes, back here. Close to the microphone.
My name is Sonia Michelle. I teach history at the University of Maryland, College Park. Given what you've been saying about corporate responsibility, I wonder where you see the possibility for paid maternity leave or parental leave in today's market. I mean, given this is one of the unfortunate ways in which the U.S. is exceptional among advanced market societies.
Is that a me question, I'm assuming?
Go ahead.
Yeah. We don't actually, as a policy organization, we don't have a position on necessarily paid maternity leave. We, of course, have a position on leave in general. Some of the companies do have paid maternity and paternity leave, some do not. It is moving along, I understand. There is a bill now that is looking fairly hopeful. I heard from one of my colleagues this morning. Corporations, based on a knee-jerk traditional response, keep in mind, they're used to objecting to that because they don't like mandates. That doesn't mean they're not at a point where they're going to embrace that easily. I think it probably is going to happen eventually. It's got a lot of support. We have California who has paid leave, and I think I just was informed Washington State. June told me this morning. Anyway, so I think it's moving 5-10 years, which is certainly a long time to wait if you're currently pregnant, but it was very few years ago when we got to vote, so.
Yeah, and that probably applies to, some basic leave in general. There's, I can't remember the statistic offhand, but a surprisingly large number of workers who have no sick leave.
Yes.
let alone the flexibility to take that because their child is sick. Yeah, Bill? Oh, yeah, it's right behind you.
I started.
This is tell.
I'm
I know who
sorry.
you are, but tell everyone else.
I'm Bill Galston from Brookings. When I started hearing about the fundamental changes in the workforce, the flood of women into the workforce, the need for flex time, more part-time, more telecommuting, et cetera, I had brown hair. If anybody had told me that we'd be having this same discussion in 2007, I wouldn't have believed it. This is not a blame game, but simply an objective statement. The private sector, if you're right about the positive returns to these measures, has been astonishingly slow to adopt them. Why is that?
Up till last year, we really hadn't made, the corporations really hadn't made public the return on the investment. They're almost afraid to measure. Keep in mind, corporations don't like to spend money measuring internally. They, kind of go with the 80% rule. Intuitively, managers know if something's working, they're getting a return on the investment. They don't like to invest all that money in very robust internal research. But they do it. The best practice companies do it. Smaller companies would never do it because they don't have the capitalization to do that. So what we did is find, the best companies we knew of in terms of reputation and flexibility and got them to share their research publicly. We are certainly hoping that it isn't another 10 years. Until they really understand there is a return. There's a huge movement on flexibility now, and I think one reason is we have decoupled flexibility from women, or we're continuing to do that. We're making more and more progress. It's important to decouple it from a woman's issue, because whenever we push historically a woman's issue, it has a long time getting traction. So it's better to couple it as a family issue, as a male issue, as well as a female issue. It's better to position it as not an accommodation, which is where we've gotten stuck. For the last decade, it's been positioned as an accommodation. What we have proven with business impacts of flexibility, it is a key management tool. It's a driver of increased performance. And I think that's a very fine but very important differentiation. If you can position it, and we have positioned it as a tool, hopefully it will be embraced.
Tom, should we be requiring some of this, maybe?
Well,
That's part of what you
I
wanted
think
to say.
the reason it's so slow is that we're going to see corporations do this in their own self-interest, as Donna just said, where it makes sense, where it fits their business strategy, and where the workforce is extremely valuable to them and they want to reduce turnover. We're not going to see, it's going to follow the same path of other kinds of benefits. If it's just left to the private sector, we're not going to see this spread universally to low-wage workers. We're not going to see it spread to companies that are trying to compete by minimizing their labor costs. Walmart doesn't believe in flexibility, and it doesn't believe in flexibility for a very clear reason. It doesn't fit their business model. They value turnover at Walmart. They don't want to reduce it for all of their employees. They do for their executives. And so you see the same kind of flexibility for their executives at Walmart as other leading corporations, but only them. So if we are going to be serious about these issues, then we have to ask, what are the engines that are going to lead to widespread diffusion? That can be government policy, but it has to be informed government policy, as everyone has been saying this morning. It can't be simply a mandate, all do the same thing. You now have an economy where there is a lot of flexibility going on, and so we need a policy that encourages firms to do more of that, that dovetails what government is doing with what the private sector is doing, and then sets some minimum standards that brings up the bottom for those that are not providing those benefits and creates more of an incentive for them to move in the direction of the leading companies that Donna is talking about. We could talk about family benefits along these lines. We could talk about training along these lines. We could talk about a whole range of things from labor policy and labor management partnerships along these lines. That's the role that government has to play. That's the role that countervailing institutions, whether it's NGOs or unions, there has to be some mechanism that creates some incentive for firms to continue to spread these kinds of benefits to those that are not necessarily going to get it just out of the self-interest and the business models that are in place in the private sector.
I want to comment on that real quickly because Tom's correct. We have not put together the documentation on flexibility among low-wage or hourly workers, but we are in the process of doing that right now. We have a piece of research in the field that's documenting the impact of flexibility for hourly workers earning earning $12 an hour and under. And we've got 6 employers that are participating in that research project. We're documenting. We have wonderful stories about the impact. So hopefully, again, we'll be able to position it as a positive ROI and begin to shine some light on the issues of hourly workers, I hope.
Okay. And it may be that the next Department of Labor can help energize some of those efforts. Bob Reich did quite a bit of that, I remember, last decade, and we haven't seen much of that work recently. To stay on schedule, we just take one more question right now. I think, Dallas, did you have something?
Dallas Salisbury with the Employee Benefit Research Institute. It's more a comment based on the first panel and this one, which is the rationale being given by a number of folks as to why there needs to be a social contract. And there have been the repeated statements that everybody used to have a 30-year job. Well, if we look at the data, 25 years or more of tenure of those 55 plus has never broken above 20% in the time that we've ever kept the data. And, I mean, the government's ever kept the data. If you look at it with pensions, in 75, the first year that the government measured through the Census Bureau, the proportion of all retirees over 65 with pension income from private employment was 9.2%. There may well be many, many reasons to have a definition of what the social contract going forward is, but it really isn't about changes in massive employment patterns. We've always been an extraordinarily short-tenured, high-tenured world, low unionization rates, et cetera. And I think that Joe's comment about the Social Security policy of CED, the comment that Kelly made, that Carmen made in the first panel, which is the individual mandate, is really this comes down to the existing system has not led to anything approaching universal coverage. The free market is moving further away from universal coverage. It's really a question of, do we want people to have some level of income security and health care? That has not been our social policy vis-a-vis supplementation of governmental programs, and that really would seem to be what this discussion, I would suggest, is heavily about. It's not about job change. It's about really what it is we need to provide.
Yeah, it's a good point about what sort of basic foundation of economic security folks need to have the opportunity to rise further. Is our panel any last comments on what Dallas said or anything else?
Good point.
All right. Well, then, I want to thank the panel for their insights, and I'll turn it back over to Reed Kramer.
All right, we'll take our next shift here, and thanks to the panelists on the employer's role. We're going to focus now on the role of civil society. So we're going to bring up Brian Gallagher, President of the United Way of America, Diana Aviv, President of the Independent Sector, and Michael Lipsky, Senior Program Director at Demos. So please help yourselves to coffee, maybe some snacks along the way, and the logistical announcement for following this panel is that you should remain seated, and lunch will find you. Will be passed around, and you'll be able to eat it at your tables. I'll remind you that again at the close of this session, but those are the marching orders from my colleagues about how we'll handle this next, handle the lunchtime period. I think we've also there's recognized, and there's a greater sense that these issues have a high relevance and salience here in America as well. And traditionally, America has always been recognized as having this vibrant civil society. It's been a long-standing feature of our culture, our society, noted by de Tocqueville centuries ago, and still relevant today, combined with the rule of law. These were defining features of the American society and system. And these were the voluntary associations. These were whether they were organized ethnically or community-based, cultural. They played a big role in our society, and in a diverse role. And we've now increasingly come to rely on them to provide services. And their needs as organizations and as mediating institutions need to be considered, need to be part of the conversation. But they also do have responsibilities, and in some very basic respects, they're creatures of policy, especially the ones that depend upon the nonprofit designation in the tax code. So we need to make sure that they're organizations that are included in our social policy framework, and that's what this panel is designed to do today. Michael, I'll turn it over to you. He also has written on these topics extensively, 2 very significant books, Street Level Bureaucracy and Nonprofits for Hire, which have been very influential over the years with a number of readers. Michael.
Thank you very much, Reed, and thanks for the invitation to participate in this conversation. How many of you work for a nonprofit organization or on the board of a nonprofit organization? Then you share with me an understanding that the cost of health care is the most vexing problem in the short run for all of the budgets of the organizations we either work for or help to govern. And I would argue that nonprofit organizations probably have never been part of the social contract with respect to the provision of health care. Nonprofits have a different resource base. They depend upon grants. Their financial stability is more questionable, perhaps, than private employers. It'd be interesting to fully bring people from the nonprofit and civil society sector into these discussions. The invitation that was extended to me was to make very preliminary stage-setting remarks. Reed has anticipated half of them, so let me just make a few comments and then turn it over to Diana. The term civil society is often used much more broadly than probably the one we want to use today. We probably want to be talking about the organized civil society, not the churches, not including labor unions for these purposes, not including family associations and so on, but the organized nonprofit associations. And with respect to that, we have to keep in mind that the nonprofit community, so to speak, is extremely diverse. Yes, it includes the large national organizations such as the Red Cross, the United Way, Second Harvest, the American Medical Association. It also includes the hospitals, and it includes the neighborhood service centers and all of the organizations that contract for very specific social provision in our cities and communities. I'm thinking, for example, of HIV/AIDS outreach organizations, needle exchange programs, neighborhood WIC distributors. The blossoming of the nonprofit service sector has been remarkable in the last generation, and it's a key component in the service distribution network, as Reed was implying. And I'd be interested in how our speakers focus our attention on not just the larger nonprofits, but the smaller ones as well. We have to recognize that, to make another point, that civil society is deeply interdependent with government. Reed alluded to this, but and perhaps our speakers will say more about this, but their tax status, in a sense, predicts some of their structures. Contributions to nonprofit organizations are privileged, and that increases the amount of resources that go to them. But there are limitations on the behavior of people who work in nonprofits that also are determined by government. And the compact between the nonprofit sector and and government, one supposes, is dynamic and shouldn't be taken for granted. It wasn't that long ago that the new tax laws were put into place that gave rise to the behaviors that we see today, and that and periodically, as our speakers undoubtedly both know and may talk about, they're constantly interacting with congressional leadership in order to try to find a contract between the two sectors that allows both to thrive. The last point I'd make is that the interaction of the two sectors is very substantial when it comes to contracting. So much service provision, which we think is delivered by the nonprofit sector, is funded by government under contracts that are either well or ill managed, well or poorly constructed, and we gain tremendous. Our society is so much better off when the nonprofit government connection works well, but it also experiences some of its worst nightmares when contracting is neglected, and not only in the military realm, but on the domestic realm as well. Let me leave leave my remarks there and call on Diana to address you.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate that, and I'm really pleased to be here, especially with Brian Gallagher, who I know will probably contradict half the things I say, and if not, provoke the rest of you anyway. But my job here in the short time that I have is to talk a little bit about civil society's role in the social contract. And in addition to that, I want to offer you some thoughts about what I mean, or to get this conversation going, what I mean when I refer to civil society. Michael, you got it right. We're not going to talk about the very broad, but I just want to say that according to the Centre on Civil Society at the London School of Economics, they describe civil society refers to the arena of uncoerced collective action around shared interests, purposes, and values. Civil societies are often populated by organizations such as registered charities, development non-governmental organizations, community groups, women's organizations, faith-based organizations, professional associations, trade unions, self-help groups, social movements, business associations, coalitions, and advocacy groups. James Madison once said, during a 1794 speech to a nascent House of Representatives, the government of the United States is a definite government confined to specific objects. Charity is no part of the legislative duty of government. And in his book on civil society, Mike Edwards, who many of you know is at the Ford Foundation, concludes that, and I quote him, that there are no solutions to social, economic, and political problems in the 21st century that do not involve civil society. And I would agree with that. You wouldn't be surprised. Why would I work there if I didn't agree with that? I want to focus, though, on that portion of civil society that is the nonprofit community. Within the tax code, there are a host of stated purposes that allow for nonprofit status, ranging from professional associations and trade unions set up to benefit a select industry or a group of individuals, to charitable groups set up to advance the common good. Today, I will be focusing on this latter group, the family of organizations commonly referred to as nonprofit, social, voluntary, or the independent sector, or even strictly by the tax code designation, 501c3s. We are more commonly known for what we are not than what we are, being the not-for-profit community. And in research that my organization did last year, we discovered, and this year, we discovered that the reason that we are known for that is because the public at large prefers to see us that way, because that defines our purpose as compared with others, that our intentions are to serve the public good and not to have some kind of benefit for ourselves. Now, let me describe a little bit about the sector, because it's not as well known as it might otherwise be. This is a sector with 9.5 million employees in the United States, accounting for 6.6% of the wages paid in the U.S., adding up to over 5% of GDP. In 2005, 29% of all Americans, totaling 65.4 million people, engaged on a voluntary basis through some kind of charitable organization. The volunteer workforce represents the equivalent of more than 9 million full-time employees at an estimated value of $280 billion. To put that in perspective, $280 billion is greater than the gross domestic product of Sweden. A nonprofit sector of just over 1.9 million organizations, although let me make clear that the group that I'm referring to is just over 1 million organizations, and if you look specifically at that particular group of organizations, 70% of them have budgets of less than $500,000, and only 4% of them have budgets of over $10 million. But a nonprofit sector of over 1.9 million organizations with combined annual budgets of almost $1 trillion and assets totaling $3 trillion, I would suggest to you is a force for progress, or at the very least has the potential to be. Let me begin here also with my understanding of the social compact, or as you've described it today, the social contract. And I understand you're talking about it specifically relative to healthcare, but obviously it has got much broader ramifications than that. I view the social compact as that intricate set of explicit relationships and implicit understandings that connect we the people to one another, and that connect us all to the government, to the world of commerce and business, and to the multitude of civic and charitable organizations that are so characteristic of America. Nonprofits, business, and government are the three pillars on which American society stands. We mostly have come to believe that a responsible and effective government, or actually governments in plural, is an essential part of our society. And we've been willing to pay for it, at least some of it: free education for children, some health care coverage for poor and disabled people, workmen's compensation, earned income tax credits for poor families, free public libraries and parks. The list goes on and on. But as I say, we've been willing to pay only for some of it. Those opportunities and protections are only part of our social compact. Such a compact, to my way of thinking, must give people a real chance to be the best that they can be, must make fairness, opportunity, decency, creativity, fulfillment of aspirations, meaningful engagement as commonplace as accountability, responsibility, and duty. It must encourage compassion and mutual respect. It must celebrate diversity, and it recognizes that some of America's children need protection and assistance, while all need encouragement and a way to make their dreams a reality. Our social compact must recognize that this society is part of an increasingly interdependent world, and our work with other nations should reflect the same respect and values we aspire to at home. While there are major differences of opinion about just how much we are willing to pay for and for which programs and services, and while we have not necessarily concluded that government is best suited to running all of the programs it funds, all save a few have recognized the important role that government must play in the lives of its citizens. Government's partnership with the nonprofit sector allows it to fulfill some of its most important responsibilities to its citizenry. Providing services is rightly the domain of this sector. Shouldering the cost, however, has to be a shared responsibility. A necessary part of the social compact, both implicit and explicit, is government's responsibility to provide the resources to the charitable community so that together they can meet their responsibilities and commitments to our citizenry. Some have proffered the idea that the responsibility for our country's most vulnerable people ought to be the responsibility of families and nonprofit organizations that serve them, ought to be the exclusive responsibility. To buttress their point, they cite of late Warren Buffett and Bill Gates' generosity and suggest that there are other individuals of immense wealth who could similarly be encouraged to support unmet needs of society. Add to that the foundations that already exist. Well, generous as he has been, Mr. Buffett's annual addition of $1.5 billion is less than 1% of the total $260 billion in charitable contributions given last year by all individuals and foundations combined. There are surely millions of people who share Mr. Buffett's generous impulse, albeit in smaller increments. Yet there is no way, not even remotely, that private funding can fuel our sector. We need to get realistic about our capabilities. Let me share with you a little bit about the sources of funding, and it's a little different from what you said, Michael. Private contributions only amount to 20% of the charitable sector's funding. And by private contributions, I'm referring to individuals, which is about 16.8%, foundations, which are 2.2%, and corporate giving programs, which are 1.02%. The rest comes from the following. Dues, fees, and charges, dues for services, are 38%. Government is 31% of funding, and all other revenue is 11%. What separates us and allows us to be a particularly useful partner, I believe, in the social contract, are our collective missions to serve the public good, our not-for-profit status that I referred to before. Where political calculations and profit generation often provide the bottom lines for other sectors, our only bottom line is to serve the public, to improve lives and strengthen communities. And from that, we derive our credibility as well. Our philosophical underpinnings include altruism, which affirms that all human beings have a basic moral obligation to look beyond themselves, pluralism, building the strength of our democracy through respecting the differences among citizens, fostering free and creative expression, and bringing voice to the voiceless, and community. Our organizations create, nourish, enlarge, and sustain communities. And the more practical underpinnings of our work are that we are incubators of innovation. I would suggest to you that we are nimbler than the slow-moving bureaucratic government, or governments in plural, and we are many times gap fillers. The nonprofit community also offers other voices and other contributions to the social compact. We are, I would suggest to you, a moral voice of the people that helps to describe and define the kind of society in which we want to live and the kind of world in which we want to be a part. You should know that the sector includes, and this is the nonprofit charitable sector, includes 350,000 houses of worship, and also add to that the public interest organizations and those committed to advancing health and welfare, freedom of speech and association, human knowledge and creativity. Its stakeholders care about society and are, by and large, committed to improving and repairing the world. If you raise your hand and cite to me an example of one that isn't, I would suggest to you that they shouldn't be part of us. Inasmuch as government does not meet its obligations to the social compact, I believe that the nonprofit sector has a central responsibility to hold government accountable for both what it does and how it conducts its business. And I would suggest to you that vice versa is true. Government has responsibility for oversight over the charitable sector as well. There is a reciprocal kind of a relationship. There is not enough time in the talk today, in my formal remarks, to talk about the nonprofit sector's relationship with the business sector and how these three sectors interact with one another. So briefly, all I will say and note is that increasingly, save some dollars that are set aside for philanthropic purposes, I see in business a world that is increasingly disconnected from the affairs of community as well as local and national governments. And to me, this is a cause for deep concern, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to discuss this further. In conclusion, I'd say that government, business, and the charitable sector each have essential roles to play if our society is to be the nurturing environment in which people thrive. Those roles are stronger when they're fulfilled through collaborative partnerships and where there's inherent recognition of the distinctive roles of each and the value of the other. The charitable sector, and more broadly, civil society's role is in building communities and empowering individuals, and that cannot be achieved in isolation. It depends on the resources mostly of government and to a lesser degree on business as well. It also has a role in defining the priorities and describing what a decent society looks like, and it further has the responsibility of holding government and business accountable for their action. When all of these roles and responsibilities are fulfilled, so to the will of civil society's end and to the social compact. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Michael. Let me also say it's a great pleasure to be here this morning, and as Diana and I were sitting talking, it seemed to make sense for her to lead off with a broader perspective of the sector, and quite honestly, every time I speak to a group like this, I'm a little reticent knowing how much research and study you put into what I'm about to talk about. But on the flip side, what I would suggest is organizations like United Way are those organizations that actually have to go apply the learning and the policy and so forth. And I want to speak to it from that perspective. Because I've been in this national position now for 6 years, but I've spent over 20 years in local communities across the country. And so I want to give you that perspective because we are very large, but we're also very small. And one of the things I'm going to suggest is that there's no question that there is an emerging new social contract, and we need to think about it differently for lots of reasons you've talked about this morning, and I'll share some others. But it's my perspective that that contract will get created from the bottom up, not from the top down. That it really is local communities and then states and so forth that will innovate faster than we will nationally. And I think the other perspective I'm going to bring to my remarks this morning is that I think it is, if you think about civil society, it is the voluntary association that is most important, not even the nonprofit institutions themselves, because those are creatures of nonprofit or voluntary association. We are at United Way the largest, in aggregate, the largest privately supported nonprofit in the country. There are now 1,300 local United Ways across the U.S. In 2006, total private sector giving to United Ways just crossed the $4 billion mark. We operate in 46 countries around the world. There is just over $1 billion U.S. contributed to those affiliates around the world. Importantly, I think more important than the money, especially for this conversation this morning, is that in order for us to be successful, we have to be a reflection of the entirety of a community. There are about 500 people who have given $1 million or more to their local United Way. There are 25,000 people who give $10,000 or more per year to their local United Way. But there are just under 13 million individual donors, and if you take 93% of those 13 million individual donors, their average annual contribution is about $200 a year. When a United Way works well, it's not that it raises a lot of money, it brings different interests together into collective action. The most valuable asset that a United Way has is the diversity of its relationships. And I want to reinforce something that Diana just said. We too often, I think, in this conversation, talk about the relationship between government and the nonprofit sector, or government and the business sector. And when we say public-private partnership, we're usually talking government and business. It doesn't work without the nonprofit sector. It doesn't work without the voluntary association, business, government, nonprofits, and voluntary association, whether there's a nonprofit or a government around it or not, which I'll come back to in a minute. It's, I won't use the campaign slogan, but from our perspective, the contract has to begin with the marketplace. It is about the economy. If we don't create the kind of jobs that gives broad-based opportunity for the majority of individuals and families in the country, it really doesn't matter what the nonprofit community does. It really doesn't matter what government does. Now, clearly, especially as you watch developing countries around the world, there has to be good public policy that allows that to happen. But I would suggest in this economy, it starts with, do we create the kind of jobs today that we need in order to create a contract that would allow government and the nonprofit sector to do what it needs to do? Because if you think of our sector, it really grew up, it really developed because of the Industrial Revolution. As we move from an agrarian economy to a national industrial economy, and folks move from rural areas into cities, families caring for themselves, neighbors caring for themselves alone wasn't enough. We created nonprofit organizations, but it was driven by the fact that there were, as time went on, there were jobs that allowed people with a high school degree or less to sustain themselves. As Diana said, the nonprofit community became gap fillers. I can tell you from my work in local United Ways that we would look at the needs of local citizens in our communities whether it was daycare needs or housing needs or whatever it was, we would divide clients into 3 different groups: those that were publicly subsidized because of income and other criteria, those that could pay their own way, and those that fell in the gap. And that's what we funded. We were gap fillers in the nonprofit sector. Government obviously had a critical role in terms of child labor, antitrust law, tax law. Increasingly over the last century, as Michael mentioned, government continued to outsource the work of direct service to people. They had a safety net responsibility in that old contract. Increasingly, they outsource it to family service organizations, to YMCAs, and so forth. But fundamentally, what we believe is that it was the Industrial Revolution that created jobs that then defined the role that government had to play and nonprofits had to play. And as I get into what I think needs to go forward, think of just a few examples. The Civil Rights Movement was not driven by nonprofit organizations or even collection of churches that came together and said, let's get this going, or governors saying, working with business to create a new way of creating equal opportunity. It was citizens coming together, rising up, deciding that what needed to happen in the country wasn't happening, and that's what pushed social change and legislative change. Mothers Against Drunk Driving is another example. We were not taking the kind of action that we needed to as government leaders, as business leaders, and others until ordinary citizens started pushing for that change. As smart as Mike Bloomberg is, I'm sure he didn't get up one morning and decide, why don't we ban smoking in all public places throughout New York City, or Rich Daley, the same thing in Chicago. It was citizens moving to move their government into action because they wanted the change. It doesn't come from government down, it doesn't come from business down in most cases, it comes from community up. We're not going to legislate our way, in my view, to changing human behavior. Human behavior and the association of human beings together usually is what drives social change and legislative change and business change, because business is always watching that marketplace. So over the last 20 years, as you've been talking about all morning, it's the enormous economic transformation that we've gone through in the country and the world that is, my view, requiring us to think through the need for a different contract. The global economy is now, as every marketplace will dictate, you will find what you are best at, what differentiates you, and you will do that. You will do it at the expense of other things. So we don't manufacture as much because we're now in a global marketplace, and we have to compete with other countries. Therefore, we're a knowledge-based economy and a service-based economy, as was mentioned in a moment ago. And it has changed the distribution of income and wealth in the U.S. And that has directly affected, I think, government, but certainly let me just talk to the nonprofit sector. That idea of gap filling, you're in a local United Way or you're in a nonprofit organization, the days where you could count the number of individuals or families that weren't succeeding on the upward economic spiral, national economic spiral, that's over. There are so many people, so many families that are not part of this economic success that the old systems, the old approach to social services and to government, I would submit, were built for the old economy. So we now are faced with trying to figure out how do you make a significant change to how you create policy, how you fund things, who you partner with. And the new contract, in my mind, has to deal with the fact that the price of lack of education, for instance, in the national industrial economy was not as severe as the price is today. You could be my father with an 8th grade education, immigrate from Ireland to Chicago, get a union card, be a union plumber, make enough money. When he got laid off for extended periods of time, you could live on food stamps, you could get public assistance when you needed it, you could get access to nonprofit organizations, as I did, as my mother did, and that was enough to keep you steady enough to take advantage of the opportunity that the economy presented. Education, if you go to Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana, at $2,500 a year, you can actually get a construction job in the summer and allow yourself to pay for that education. All that's gone. All that's gone in terms of the contract. So in my view, what has to happen in terms of how we think about this is we should start with the economy first. What does the market create in terms of opportunities? If jobs aren't being created in the U.S. that are being created somewhere else because we don't have the workforce in the U.S. to fill them, then we need to deal with the fact that the job training systems in the U.S. are broken, the fact that the education system in many places are broken, and that it's all tied, in my mind, to create the kind of jobs that create the kind of opportunities that allow people to sustain themselves. It has to be results-oriented, so, you know, everyone held accountable in terms of what is to be created. It needs to be integrated, so you can't have a government program not tied to business, not tied to the nonprofit community. We need non-traditional partnerships and strategies, and maybe we can talk about that in the question and answer. The system and the contract need to be people-centered. Nationally and locally, I've worked in lots of collaborative, integrative efforts where it was about institutions. School system, United Way, mental health system, the Chamber of Commerce, and we went through all this planning that was about integrating the institutions, which doesn't matter much if it doesn't actually impact the individuals that those institutions are designed to serve. Public accountability and metrics. If we're going to take on, for instance, graduation or truancy rates and so forth, all those institutions have to come together and say, we are committed to increasing the graduation rate by 15 or 20% over the next 5 years. We'll hold ourselves publicly accountable. The media has to be a partner in it. Or in my view, and in our experience, you don't really create systems change. Informal voluntary association is critical. The political campaigns have already figured it out. The viral strategies, YouTube, Facebook, whatever it is, in terms of citizen engagement, we have to use those new channels knowing that we can't control where they take it. The same way you couldn't control the civil rights movement, you won't control young people using technology in terms of trying to recreate the social contract in America and the world. Finally, let me say that being a very large funder of social services, I've personally come to the conclusion over the last 8 or 10 years that we're not going to social service our way to a different result for families across America, or for that matter, across the globe. In a lot of cases, what a family or an entire neighborhood or even a city needs is not more social workers. What they need are good jobs close to where they live. They need safety in their neighborhoods. They need a school system that actually works for them. And in fact, we've had conversations with large foundations and other players too, the same way that we've kind of institutionalized communities and schools, aggregating social services, integrating it with the work of public education. Why wouldn't we have financial stability strategies that try to do the same thing? How do you get more income in people's pockets, either through a better job or public benefits that they don't know they're aware of? How do you help folks build savings through savings initiatives and through good policy? And how do you help folks start to gain assets? That's what, in my view, will build enough stability for a contract to get reestablished between government, the marketplace, nonprofit sector, through that kind of voluntary association. If we will, in my view, think not even beyond institutions or sectors, but begin with how do you create opportunity for the majority of people in America around job creation and the right kind of jobs that allow you to sustain yourself, and then force government, nonprofit sector, other leaders to find how do you support that kind of work. If we don't do that, we will have, in my view, a series of academic conversations and public policy debates that will lead to incremental change in terms of collaboration and some policy change, but fundamentally probably not change the way people live in the country. Thanks very much.
I'm sure you can see why I feel so privileged to be on the panel with these distinguished leaders. Let me mention two issues that occur to me that I think might be the basis for discussion, and ask our speakers to comment on it or not comment it as you prefer. It seems to me that focusing on, as Diana said, nonprofit organizations being the organized place where people come together to express values, that part of the nonprofit sector that is more or less advocacy oriented, and recognizing that nonprofits are often at the center of community conversations about what people want. I suggest that there's a tension between what we want to mean by a new social compact. We could mean, and I think maybe this is unfair, but the first part of this conversation this morning was about institutional arrangements that might make social provision both more affordable and more available to more people, considering that health care is broken and so on. That's an institutional, let's put the pieces in place, let's have elite conversations that will create a fix on the social policy side. Diana and Brian, I think, are both suggesting that we might want to mean something else by a social compact, which is, what is it that we want to ask of one another? What responsibilities do we want to accept for one another, and what do we want to provide for people who can't provide for themselves? That's a different idea of the social compact, and it implies, of course, with leadership, but it implies that one would have to take this discussion to communities and states and localities throughout the country to gain a consensus about what we expect of each other. How much hazard should people be able to, should put on themselves? What kind of risks do we accept, people shall accept for themselves, and how much do we want to socialize the risk? And that's a very different notion, and it suggests that, in a sense, we're having a contest as to what we mean by the social compact. A second point that was not mentioned here, but it seems to me implicit in drawing up, bringing in the civil society to the discussion, is that both liberals and conservatives have recognized the critical role of social organizations and service provision. Putting it crudely, liberals see a need, and if the need is substantial enough, they will seek to put in place programs to fund them. Conservatives recognize that many social organizations play a critical role in society, but are worried that funding of those organizations will, in some ways, decrease the capacity or undermine the interest of people in supporting those organizations. The moral hazard of, say, for example, providing home care for the elderly, which might drive out family-provided home care without subsidy. These are questions that will arise in a new social compact, and but it hasn't arisen today, and I think in a discussion of civil society, it's a particularly appropriate question, at least to put on the agenda.
Well, at least from my perspective, we are trying to make the point that there's been a lot written and talked about recently about what does it mean by trying to create and advance the common good. And certain folks will use that from a faith-based perspective, and others will use it from different perspectives. But we do believe that special interests, and I don't mean that in a bad way or a political way, but special interests can be served, and you can succeed. Your interests can succeed by focusing on your interests for some period of time. But over the long term, if the collective interest in an organization, in a community, in a country, in the world isn't addressed, and there isn't opportunity that gets created for the vast majority of folks in whatever that sphere is, everyone's going to fail. And it's, I didn't get into our planning assumptions, but I can tell you, included on a short list of 6 planning assumptions that we at United Way are making is that the income gap and the asset gap in the U.S., besides economic and social provision ramifications, have civil society ramifications. That if we don't deal with the common good and don't deal with that gap, not just of money but of opportunity, that we run the risk of civil unrest. And that's not good for government, that's not good for business, that's not good for communities, but we believe we're running that risk right now. So if you listen to Warren Buffett make the point about his gift, and even if you listen to his argument about the estate tax, he makes 2 arguments. That if we concentrate the wealth and power in too few hands, we will not create enough broad-based opportunity because that redistribution won't happen the way that it should, and that threatens society. And the second is that he believes it creates laziness in the marketplace. That if you put too much resource in too few hands, whether it's corporate or family, then you'll actually hold down innovation. So, Michael, to your point, there's a lot of interest for everybody to think much more collectively about how we define and then execute whatever the contract is.
Michael, I think you made more general comments than questions, but having said that, I'm going to comment on your comments. If you look at other societies and the way in which they're organized around the world, there are any number of Western-type democracies that don't have vigorous, athletic civil societies. I can't tell you how many times I get called from places as far-flung as Australia, New Zealand, nearer to home, Germany, all sorts of places where their democracies may be comparable in one form or another, but where their civil societies are substantially inactive. And in many of those places, the people who come to visit me are not members of civil society. They're almost always government leaders. And the folks who came from Japan came from the Nippon Airlines as the leaders who showed up. Recently, I was visited by a whole range of leaders from China, and they were all government officials from various and sundry departments, all wanting to know how they can help stimulate a civil society. Now, I might, in those instances, begin to think about and get into with them why they're coming to do this. Are they looking to see how civil society can provide it all, whereas government can provide less of it? Is that part of the motivation? Or is part of the motivation that they feel that that leg of their stool is rather weak and they want to strengthen it? So regardless of motivation, I think that you are right in describing, at least how I defined it, but I think Brian as well, that we see that you cannot have a society in America that has meaningful solutions to anything without involving civil society in some kind of meaningful way. It's not simply a deal between government and business that makes things happen. After all, this conclave this morning is run by a nonprofit organization with a 501c3 tax-exempt status last time I looked. If you don't have one, renew it. And so I think that that is a given. To me, there's a bigger question. And you and I had a sidebar conversation in which I'd said to you, I hope this is not going to be a conversation only about what is the social compact and what ought it to be, but to moving that agenda forward, which is how we can work together in a different kind of a way to produce the kind of results that we all want. What is it that we want? It's a kind of a society that most people will agree with. And the big question is who's going to make it happen and who's going to put in what muscle to get to that result. And we have a role to play. I think we ought to get on to the business of what those issues are.
So I believe I'm responsible for taking and managing questions over there in the back. And your name and affiliation would be appreciated. Try to make it the correct affiliation.
I'm John Alec. I'm John Alec. I'm a contingent worker. This question's for Brian Gallagher. You made 2 points very strongly. One is that social change comes from the bottom up. The other is that a precondition, really, I'm perhaps putting words in your mouth, the precondition for a new social contract is better jobs for more people. How can we reconcile those? Can we get better jobs for more people from the bottom up?
Let me make the point about bottom up is, in my experience, solutions to really difficult issues, issues around education, issues around housing, in my experience, have almost always been first resolved locally, and then at state level and so forth. So that's what I mean. And let me tie it to jobs in that, you know, and this isn't to take a shot at workforce investment boards, you know, the former, you know, PIC boards and so forth. But I've served on those, and I don't have much faith in change being created at a state or a federal level that will redefine how the players in that local training system make enough change to provide enough local citizens to fill the jobs that exist today that pay more than pay enough for folks to sustain themselves, except doing it community by community and location by location until you get a sense of best practice and a standard, and then that can drive larger policy. If you know, we're in this nexus between large and small employers and government and nonprofit agencies and people who are served by all. And what businesses tell you is that there are jobs that if they could get the right people trained, prepared, that those jobs exist. I personally believe that we're going to find more solutions in how you make substantial change on a local workforce development level before it will get resolved and legislated down. And so that's how I would reconcile the two.
Other questions, Victor?
This question that is, then we have to find, in addition to the locus of power, we have to find leverages of power over other groups in other societies and to make them work. And lastly, the element of culture. Here we are talking about accountability, responsibility, and so on and so forth. But how do we create a culture of truly responsibility? And how do we use the power that exists in society and the leverages of power to bring about that culture?
Some very small questions you ask here. You know, on the first two issues, the locus and leverage of power, I can only talk to you about that as a practitioner, not as a theorist, and tell you that we spend an awful lot of time not only thinking about that, but figuring out ways to combine forces in such a way that we can shift agendas and get our priorities met in ways that we want. And sometimes we're successful, and most of the time we're not. And we understand very well that in the United States, the way that power works is quite different than in other parts of the world. It's one of the reasons why we have these long-winded debates about campaign finance reform and grassroots movements and voting and inclusion and all of that, because we understand that in the end, if we're not able to change the way in which government does its work, since that's where all the money is, or most of the money is, for us, and not only money, but also policy positions and ability to shape how we do our work and how people live their lives, we're going to be constrained. On the question of culture of true responsibility, that's a very long discussion of quite a different kind. There are lots of discussions in the charitable sector, especially among the civically minded organizations, about where we should begin. We know, for example, from research, that people who engage civically with their children, who are involved with their children in volunteering, even in things like food banks and soup kitchens, that sort of thing, or civically broader civic activism, that those children are more likely to do the same thing than if children learn it in any other way. But we know that there are two other ways in which people learn how to be involved. One is through school and the other one is through their religious organizations. So it should be fairly simple to say, let's provide that kind of opportunity for engagement and social responsibility through schools, and for those who do it through their religious organizations, and encourage families to volunteer as well, and the problem is solved. But in fact, we find that the kind of civic engagement that we have in schools has so stultified that there are lots of people who, in the end, don't become involved because that experience was so odious to them. I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Do you want to have a comment, Brian?
Well, very quickly, I think Andy Stern probably made the point that there is increasing power in corporations because corporations are ahead of government and the nonprofit community in and around globalization, which makes sense, but so there's growing power there. Secondly, because of technology and instant communication, there's growing power and influence in, I'll go back to it, voluntary association. That look at political campaigns now. You can stop a Senate race on a dime with a cell phone camera and posting it. Or you can influence the series of events in Iraq because at Saddam's execution, you can have a cell phone in there. There is power in access to the technology. We don't necessarily know how to steer it and leverage it, take advantage of it, but I would suggest that is worth a lot of examination and discussion.
Thank you. I'm informed that we have to wrap up this conversation and move to lunch. Reed, do you have any comments?
No, but thank
But yes, indeed. So would you join me in thanking our panelists for their comments?